Hey, you made it. You found your way here to this quiet little corner of the internet where the lights are low and the world outside can wait. I'm really glad you're here. Before we begin tonight's journey, can I ask you a small favour? If you've been here before, if my voice has ever kept you company on a sleepless night, or carried you off into a dream you didn't expect, would you take just 1 second to hit that subscribe button, and maybe a like on this video too? Not because an algorithm told me to ask, but because when you do it tells me that what I'm making actually matters to someone. And honestly, that means everything. Drop a comment below if you feel like it. Tell me where you are right now. Are you in bed, lights already off, on the couch with a blanket? Travelling somewhere I read every single one. Every single one. Now get comfortable, adjust that pillow, maybe turn on a fan for some background noise. Let the room get as soft and quiet as it wants to be. Because tonight we're going somewhere strange and gentle and a little bit wonderful. Alright, I want to start with a question. What if the best thing a doctor could do for you was absolutely nothing? No surgery, no medicine, no complicated treatment, just rest, stillness, fresh air, and time. That sounds almost too simple, doesn't it? Maybe even a little insulting if you're really sick. You show up at the doctor's office terrified and they look at you very seriously and say, "Go lie down." But here's the wild thing: for nearly a century, "go lie down" was the most sophisticated medical advice on earth, backed by science, prescribed by the greatest minds in medicine, and for a certain group of patients it genuinely, mysteriously worked. This is the story of the rest cure, and it is stranger, more beautiful and more complicated than you might imagine. Let's go back to the 1800s. Not the glamorous part of the 1800s, not the ball gowns and the candlelit drawing rooms. The frightening part. Because in the 1800s there was a disease that terrified people the way cancer terrified the 20th century. It was called consumption. We know it today as tuberculosis, and consumption was everywhere. By the dawn of the 19th century, tuberculosis had killed 1 in 7 of all the people who had ever lived. Let that number sit for a moment. 1 in 7 of everyone, ever. It moved slowly and cruelly. It started with a cough, then fatigue, then weight loss, that slow quiet wasting away that gave the disease its name. People called it the White Plague because of how pale its victims became. Poets called it romantic. Doctors called it a death sentence. And the honest truth was nobody knew what to do about it. Some physicians prescribed bleeding. Some prescribed sea air. Some prescribed opiates to dull the cough. Some prescribed nothing at all because nothing seemed to help. But then in the middle of the 19th century, something interesting happened. A few independent doctors working oceans apart from each other without cell phones or academic journals or emails stumbled onto the same unlikely idea. What if rest could heal the lungs? What if stillness, clean air and enough food could give the body the strength it needed to fight back on its own? The man who first turned this idea into a real institution was a German doctor named Hermann Bremer. Bremer was interesting before he ever became a doctor. As a young man, he had fallen ill with tuberculosis himself, which in the 1850s was approximately a death sentence with extra steps. His doctor told him to go somewhere with clean mountain air, so Bremer, being German and apparently deeply committed to doing things thoroughly, packed his bags and walked into the Himalayan mountains. And he got better. He came home, finished his medical training, and immediately started asking why. Why did the mountains help? He developed a theory, a somewhat incorrect theory as it turned out, but a useful one, that the heart worked differently at high altitude, and that this change somehow helped the lungs heal. Whether or not he was right about the mechanism, he was onto something real about the outcome. In 1863, Bremer opened a dedicated tuberculosis facility in Gebersdorf, in what is now Poland. Patients were exposed to plentiful amounts of high-altitude fresh air and good nutrition. They were asked to rest, to sleep long hours, to eat enormous meals, to walk slowly through pine forests and breathe deeply. And some of them, not all but some, started to recover. Word travelled, other doctors paid attention, and slowly a movement began. On the other side of the Atlantic, a young American doctor named Edward Trudeau had his own brush with the disease. Trudeau had watched his older brother die of tuberculosis when they were young men. He had held his brother's hand through the final weeks. He had made the decision partly because of that loss to become a physician. And then in 1872, just a year after finishing medical school, he discovered that he too had tuberculosis. Dr. Edward Livingston Trudeau, who lived from 1848 to 1915, was the first American to promote isolation as a means not only to spare the healthy, but to heal the sick. But before he became that person, he was just a sick young man trying not to die. Trudeau had heard about the mountain air cure. He had read the European reports. He didn't have much faith in them, but he also didn't have many options. So in 1873 he took himself to the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York. He expected to die there quietly in the clean cold air away from the city that had made him sick. Instead, he started to feel better, slowly, tentatively, mysteriously, better. He began spending more time outdoors. He rested more than he worked. He ate well, and his body, which had been losing its battle against the bacteria destroying his lungs, began to push back. He did not understand exactly why. Nobody did yet. But 12 years later, in 1885, Trudeau opened a small red cottage at Saranac Lake, New York, the first public tuberculosis sanatorium in the United States. He called it the Adirondack Cottage Sanatorium. His patients came from all over the country. He required them to follow a strict regimen of diet and exercise. They were given 3 meals every day and a glass of milk every 4 hours. They sat on wide open porches in every kind of weather. They breathed, they rested, they waited. What started as a single red cottage eventually became a small village, a 22-building complex that included a library, a chapel, and an infirmary. Now here is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because the sanatorium movement wasn't just about tuberculosis. It started there, but it spread. By the late 1800s, doctors were prescribing rest cures for all sorts of conditions: nervous exhaustion, anxiety, depression, what they called hysteria, fatigue, emotional breakdown. And at the centre of this second wave of rescue medicine was one of the most complicated figures in American medical history, Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell. Mitchell was brilliant, genuinely frighteningly brilliant. He had served as a surgeon during the Civil War, treating soldiers with catastrophic nerve injuries, and his research on those injuries helped establish the entire field of neurology in the United States. He was the first person to describe phantom limb syndrome in clinical detail. He was a pioneering scientist. He was also, by modern standards, a deeply troubling physician. The rest cure that Mitchell pioneered rose to surprising popularity in the late 1800s, and several physicians adopted and practiced the treatment for decades. Only later did it become a textbook example of the disturbing nonlinearity of American medical progress, the kind of quackery that can live alongside rigorous medical innovation. Here is how the cure worked. A patient, almost always a woman, almost always educated and upper class, would arrive at Mitchell's office. She might be suffering from depression, anxiety, exhaustion, or any number of symptoms that Mitchell grouped under the label of nervous disease. Mitchell would examine her, and then he would prescribe the following. The treatment typically entailed 6 to 8 weeks of absolute bed rest. Patients were most often placed in complete isolation, interacting only occasionally with the nurse. 6 to 8 weeks. In bed. Completely still. They were not allowed to read. not allowed to write, not allowed to receive friends or family, not allowed to sit up except to be spoon-fed. The intellectual and creative women who made up most of Mitchell's patient list, writers, artists, thinkers, were told essentially that their minds were the problem, and their minds needed to be switched off. They were fed enormous amounts of food, milk, cream, meat. The goal was to gain weight rapidly, which Mitchell believed would restore the blood, a concept he borrowed from a medical tradition that was already going out of fashion in his own lifetime. One patient, referred to only as Mrs. C, lay in bed for over a month drinking quart after quart of milk. By the end of the treatment, she'd gained 40 pounds, and Mitchell counted her among his most successful cases. He was not entirely wrong about rest. That at least had something to it. But he was spectacularly wrong about almost everything else. There is a woman, you may have heard of Charlotte Perkins Gilman. In 1887, after the birth of her daughter, Gilman fell into a deep depression, what we would now recognize as postpartum depression. She could barely function. She wept constantly. She felt, as she later described it, a weight she could not lift. She was sent to Dr. Mitchell, who was at that time considered the greatest nerve specialist in the country. Mitchell diagnosed her with hysteria and began his usual treatments. Gilman was put to bed and kept there. She was fed, bathed, and rubbed. She was told to rest completely. She was forbidden from working, from writing, from doing any of the things that gave her life meaning. And when the treatment was over, Mitchell gave her final instructions that Gilman later said nearly drove her to a complete mental breakdown. He told her to live as domestic a life as possible, to have her child near her at all times, to never touch a pen brush or pencil again. Never touch a pen brush or pencil again. To a woman who was a writer, to her core. Gilman did not follow the instructions. She went back to work. She started writing again. And slowly she recovered. And then she wrote one of the most famous short stories in American literature, a story called The Yellow Wallpaper, published in 1892. It is a story about a woman imprisoned in a room forbidden from working, slowly losing her mind to the cure that was supposed to save her. It is not a subtle story, but it is an honest one. Now here is the part I want you to sit with for a moment, because this is where the story gets genuinely complicated. Because here is what science eventually discovered long after sanatoriums had become relics, and the rest cure had become a cautionary tale. The rest cure was wrong in almost all of its reasoning. Wrong about blood quality, wrong about nervous exhaustion, wrong about the danger of intellectual activity for women. But the sanatoriums for tuberculosis, they were working for a reason nobody fully understood until decades later. Years after the sanatorium movement ended, researchers demonstrated that lying flat increased blood flow to the apex of the lungs, and that this may actually have helped healing. The same effect that Bremer had aimed to achieve with exercise could also be achieved with rest. The body, given time and food and air and stillness, was doing something. The immune system, freed from the constant demand of daily life, was marshalling its resources, and in some cases, not all but some, it was winning. In 1956, a clinical researcher named Dr. Wallace Fox conducted what became known as the Madras Experiment, a randomized controlled trial comparing home treatment to sanatorium treatment for tuberculosis in India. His findings demonstrated that treatment at home was just as effective as sanatorium treatment, not only in the initial success rate, but also in the subsequent relapse rate. In other words, the mountains didn't matter. The architecture didn't matter. The pine forests and the cold, fresh air and the elegant design of Alvar Aalto's famous Finnish sanatorium, none of that on its own made the difference. What mattered was the rest, the food, the time given to the body to heal itself, which is a concept so old and so simple that it almost hurts. There is something quietly profound about all of this, I think. We live in an era of extraordinary medical power. We have antibiotics that can defeat tuberculosis in 6 months. We have surgeries that would look like magic to a doctor from 1880. We have drugs that can quiet the immune system or supercharge it or redirect it entirely. And yet, there is something in us that still knows, or at least suspects, that sometimes the most healing thing in the world is to stop, to be still, to eat a warm meal and drink a glass of water and lie down in a quiet room and let the body do what it was designed to do. The sanatorium doctors were not entirely wrong. They were working with the tools and the knowledge they had. They saw something real, they just didn't always understand what they were seeing. And the rest cure for women was genuinely harmful in many of its applications, weaponizing rest as a way to silence and control rather than to heal. But underneath all of it, underneath the mistakes and the misunderstandings and the medical arrogance, there was a kernel of something true. That the body has wisdom, that sometimes doing nothing is the hardest and most important thing, that rest is not the absence of medicine. Sometimes rest is the medicine. There is one last image I want to leave you with before we move on. Picture the Paimio Sanatorium in Finland. Built in 1933, designed by the architect Alvar Aalto, one of the most beautiful buildings of the 20th century. Pale white walls, long open balconies facing the sun. Rooms designed so that even the angle of the light on the ceiling was considered, because patients lying in bed all day would be looking up, and the architect believed that what they saw should be calming, not harsh. Patients lay all day either in beds or on specially designed chairs, the Paimio chair on sun balconies and a rooftop terrace. They lay there. They breathed the cold Finnish air. They looked at the pale winter sky. They rested. Some of them recovered. Some did not. None of them really knew why some lived and some didn't. But the building is still there. It has been a hospital and a school and a museum. Scholars travel from around the world to study it. And when you look at photographs of it, this gleaming white building in the Finnish forest, built to give sick people sunlight and stillness, it is one of the most human things you have ever seen. Because it is a monument to the belief that people are worth healing, that rest is worth building for, that a sick person lying in a bed deserves beauty and air and care. That is not nothing, that in its own quiet way is everything. And speaking of things that were stranger than they first appeared, our next story takes us somewhere even older, into a world where the most common substance in every human body was also considered the most powerful diagnostic tool in all of medicine. I promise it is not what you expect. So, before we go any further, I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. If someone told you right now that the liquid your body produces every single day, the stuff you flush away without a second thought, had for thousands of years been considered one of the most powerful diagnostic tools in all of medicine, what would you feel? Curiosity, disgust? A sudden, very strong urge to change the subject that is completely fair, and I promise we're going to handle this with as much grace and dignity as the subject allows, which is to say some grace and some dignity, and a few moments where even I had to sit back and go, really, they really did that. Yes, they really did. Let's start somewhere specific. Let's start in ancient Egypt around the year 1350 before the Common Era. 3,300 years ago, a woman suspects she might be pregnant. She has no doctor's office to visit, no pharmacy, no little plastic test with a 2-minute window and a blue line. What she has is a papyrus scroll, a handful of grain, and a surprisingly sophisticated idea. According to a medical text now held in the Berlin Museum, part of a collection so old and so rare that scholars describe handling it with something close to reverence, this woman is instructed to do the following. She's to take 2 small bags, fill one with barley, fill one with wheat, and over the course of several days she is to water both bags with her own urine. Then she waits. If the barley sprouts first, the text says she is carrying a boy. If the wheat sprouts first, a girl. If neither bag sprouts at all, she is not pregnant. Now your first instinct might be to laugh, and I understand that, but here is the part that is genuinely astonishing. In 1963, a team of researchers at the National Institutes of Health decided to actually test this method. They collected urine samples from pregnant women, non-pregnant women and men. They watered grain with each sample, and they found that in approximately 70% of cases the urine of pregnant women caused the grain to sprout. Urine from non-pregnant women and men consistently did not. 70% accuracy, from a test written on papyrus 3,500 years ago. The ancient Egyptians could not have known about estrogen. They had no concept of hormones, but elevated estrogen levels during pregnancy, which we now know affect plant germination, were doing exactly what the papyrus described. The test did not know why it worked. It just knew that it did. That is the thing about ancient medicine that I find endlessly moving. There was no lab, no microscope, no blood panel. These people were working with what they could see and smell and touch and taste and observe over centuries of careful watching, and sometimes not always, but sometimes they were right. The boy or girl prediction part of the test, that did not hold up so well. Sorry, ancient Egypt. But the pregnancy detection itself has a legitimacy that kept it alive for an almost unbelievable length of time. Variations of the wheat and barley test appeared in ancient Greek medicine, then in Roman texts, then in Arabic medicine during the medieval period. A scholar named Sophie Schiut, who spent years translating these Egyptian papyri at the University of Copenhagen, found the same basic method appearing in a book of German folklore as late as 1699, and according to at least one source, something close to the practice was still being used in parts of Asia Minor in the 1960s. While the Beatles were recording their first albums, someone somewhere was still watering grain with morning urine to see if a baby was coming. But the grain test is just the beginning of this story. Because the ancient world's relationship with urine as medicine was not just about pregnancy, it was about everything. Hippocrates, who lived in the 5th century before the Common Era and is still considered the father of Western medicine, was among many other things one of the first systematic uroscopists. That word comes from the Greek oron, meaning urine, and skopin, meaning to examine, to look carefully at. Hippocrates noted that fever changes the way a patient's urine smells. He described how blood in the urine indicated illness. He documented the appearance of sediment, the colour spectrum from pale yellow to nearly black, and what each variation might suggest about the body producing it. His observations were not random or superstitious. They are careful, repeated empirical notes made across thousands of patients. And here is what made those observations valuable. Some of them were genuinely correct. Dark concentrated urine can indicate dehydration. Blood in the urine can indicate kidney trouble or infection. The sweet smell of diabetic urine, which Hippocrates noted, and which physicians for centuries after him confirmed by taste, reflects real chemistry happening in the body. The glucose that a diabetic body cannot process properly spills into the urine, changing its smell and, yes, its taste in ways that are measurable and real. When an English doctor named Thomas Willis wrote in 1674 that the urine of patients with a particular condition tasted distinctly sweet, he was describing, without knowing it, what we now call type 1 diabetes. He was identifying a metabolic disease through sensory examination of waste fluid, and while the method makes modern audiences slightly queasy, the underlying observation was accurate. Can I ask, does anyone else feel a sudden and overwhelming gratitude for modern laboratory equipment? Just me. The practice of uroscopy, of using urine to diagnose and monitor illness, grew through the centuries until it reached something extraordinary in the medieval period. By the High Middle Ages, the urine flask had become the symbol of the medical profession, the way a stethoscope is today. A doctor without his matula, the round-bottomed glass flask specifically designed to display urine in a way that approximated the shape of the bladder, was like a carpenter without a hammer. Illuminated manuscripts, paintings, church carvings, everywhere you looked in medieval Europe the doctor was shown holding a glass vessel, up to the light examining its contents, with the concentration of a jeweller appraising a diamond. There were colour charts, illustrated guides. A medieval physician could consult a document called a urine wheel, a circular diagram showing 20 or more shades of urine from colourless water, pale through deep amber, orange, red, green, and eventually a dark and ominous black, each colour linked to a specific diagnosis or prognosis. Colourless urine indicated trouble in the brain. Deep red suggested inflammation. Green was associated with certain fevers, and the darkest colours toward the bottom of the wheel were considered signs that were very, very bad indeed. These charts were copied and passed between physicians across Europe. They were translated from Greek into Arabic, from Arabic into Latin, from Latin into every vernacular language that had a physician writing in it. The great Persian scholar Avicenna, who wrote his Canon of Medicine in the 11th century, a text that was still being used in European medical schools 500 years later, included a detailed treatment of uroscopy that described the urine of newly pregnant women as resembling the water in which chickpeas had been cooked. How do I know these things? Because scholars have spent lifetimes translating these texts. Because libraries have preserved them. Because even in the strange margins of history, people were paying attention to things that mattered to them. Now here is where the story takes a turn that I find equal parts fascinating and deeply uncomfortable. Because by the later medieval period, uroscopy had escaped the careful hands of trained physicians and moved into the general population, and it had become in a phrase I did not invent but wish I had the domain of the piss prophets. That is a real historical term. Scholars use it without irony. The piss prophets were itinerant medical practitioners, some trained many, not who travelled through towns and villages, setting up in market squares or outside church doors, promising that by examining a person's urine they could diagnose any illness, predict the course of any disease, and sometimes for an extra fee tell you how your future was looking generally. People lined up. Of course they did. In a world without germ theory, without any real understanding of why people got sick or how to make them better, someone who claimed to see your diagnosis in a glass of water, even water of that particular origin, was offering something profoundly valuable. They were offering the possibility of an answer. Some of these practitioners were genuine physicians doing legitimate work. Others were charlatans exploiting desperate people. And the line between the two was not always as clear as we might hope. One of the more colourful stories from this period involves a medieval fraudster named Roger Clark of Wandsworth, who in the year 1382 was found guilty in London of selling fake cures to the poor with no medical training and no real knowledge. His punishment was theatrical. He was placed on a horse riding backwards without a saddle as a sign of disgrace, and led through the streets of London with a urine flask hanging at his chest and another on his back. The crowd jeered. The message was clear: fake medicine, even medicine that claimed the symbols of legitimate practice, would not be tolerated. The scholar Petrarch, never one to understate, wrote memorably that the papal physicians of his day were pale and hollow-looking, because, as he put it, they spent their days rummaging around in sloshing chambers. There is one more layer to this story that I want to sit with before we move on. Because all of this, the Egyptian grain test, the colour wheels, the taste tests, the piss prophets, seems on first glance like pure historical comedy. a procession of well-meaning people doing things that make us wince. But consider what these physicians were actually trying to do. They could not open the body without killing the patient. They had no imaging technology. They could not look at blood under a microscope or run a metabolic panel. The only window they had into the interior of a living human being, the only substance the body produced continuously in volume that could be collected and examined without harm, was urine. And urine, as modern science has confirmed over and over again, is genuinely informative. It reflects kidney function. It reveals metabolic disorders. It responds to infection, dehydration medication, and hormonal change. Modern medicine still uses urinalysis as a routine diagnostic tool precisely because the information is real. We just have better instruments for reading it now. The medieval physician looking at a flask held up to the light was doing something genuine. They were reading a signal. They were just reading it with their eyes instead of a spectrometer. What I find beautiful about this, if I can use that word in a story about pee, which I'm choosing to do without apology, is the persistence of the observation. For 35 centuries across Egypt and Greece and Rome and Persia and medieval Europe and early modern Germany, the same basic insight survived. Something in this fluid tells us something about this body. The specific reading changed, the interpretation evolved, the methods improved, but the central observation stayed true, which says something, I think, about human attention, about how carefully people watch the world around them even when they had so few tools for understanding what they were seeing, and about how much those careful watchers got right. There is one last image from this chapter of history that has stayed with me. In the medical manuscripts of 14th century Europe, there is a recurring illustration. It shows a physician at work, and in many versions he is not in a grand hall or a wealthy home. He is in a modest room. A servant has brought a basket, and in the basket is a flask. The patient could not come. They sent their urine ahead. The physician holds the glass to the light of a window. He studies it. The person who delivered the flask, a maid, a family member, a neighbour, stands nearby watching his face for some sign of what he sees. Worried, hopeful, waiting. That image, I think, is not so different from the feeling of waiting for a test result today. The technology is unrecognisable, but the human beneath it, the person who wants to know, who needs an answer, who stands in a room hoping the person reading the signs will say something good, that person is exactly the same. Speaking of things the body does that puzzled and fascinated our ancestors, our next stop takes us somewhere that makes most people reach for a glass of water almost immediately. Because we're going to talk about the substances people were given to help them sleep. The potions, the powders, the syrups that promised rest and often delivered something quite a bit more than rest. Some of these substances you would recognise. Some of them you can still find at a pharmacy today, and some of them were sold to mothers for their infants in small brown bottles in the aisle right next to the bread. The story of how ordinary people dealt with pain and sleeplessness before the age of the modern medicine is stranger and sadder and stranger again than almost anything else in this long, strange journey. Right then, we just spent time with physicians peering into glass flasks, reading the body through its most humbling offering. Now we go somewhere quieter and stranger. Because this part of the story is about sleep, or rather about the lengths ordinary people went to in order to find it. About pain and the things they poured into their bodies to make pain stop. About a world where the pharmacy shelf held things that would make a modern doctor go pale. And about a very small brown bottle that millions of people kept in their medicine cabinet, in their kitchen drawer, in their nightstand, as casually as we keep aspirin. That bottle was called laudanum, and what was inside it was by any modern standard extraordinary. Let's place ourselves in the year 1840, somewhere in England, a medium-sized town, gas lamps, cobblestones, the smell of coal smoke and rain. A woman, let's call her a mill worker's wife because that is statistically who she was most likely to be, has a husband who works 14-hour days in conditions we would consider brutal. She has several children. One of them is teething, which in the 19th century was treated not as a normal stage of development, but as a genuine medical crisis linked by many physicians of the time to fevers, seizures, and a terrifying infant mortality rate. The baby will not stop crying. She has been up for 2 nights. She goes to the corner shop. The shop sells flower candles, thread lamp oil, and a row of brown bottles with handwritten labels. One of them, a popular brand freely available, recommended by her neighbours, advertised in the papers with illustrations of peaceful sleeping babies, contains as its primary active ingredient morphine, a derivative of opium, combined with a generous measure of alcohol. She buys it. She gives a few drops to the baby. The baby sleeps. She does not know she has just given her child one of the most powerful substances on earth. Nobody told her. The label calls it a soothing syrup. The advertisement calls it perfectly harmless and very pleasant to taste. And in the logic of her time, she's done exactly the right thing. This is the story of laudanum, one of the most widely used, most thoroughly misunderstood, and most consequential substances in the history of medicine. The word comes from the Latin laudare, to praise, and praised it was for centuries by physicians and poets, and ordinary people alike. Laudanum is a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol. Its modern form was standardized in the 17th century, though opium itself had been used medicinally since before recorded history. The ancient Sumerians cultivated the opium poppy around 3,000 years before the Common Era and called it the joy plant. The Egyptians used it. The Greeks and Romans knew it well. Galen, the great physician whose theories shaped European medicine for over 1,000 years, prescribed it routinely. The Arabic physician Avicenna included opium preparations in his canon of medicine, the text that trained doctors across Europe and the Middle East for centuries. By the time we reach the 18th and 19th centuries, the period when laudanum became truly ubiquitous in British and American homes, it was not a new or experimental substance. It was old. It was trusted. It was, as one historian called it, the aspirin of the 19th century. And like aspirin, it was taken for everything: coughs, diarrhea, rheumatism, insomnia, anxiety, menstrual pain, grief, teething, cholera symptoms, nervous exhaustion, what the Victorians called women's troubles, which was a category so broad it essentially meant any suffering experienced by a woman that her doctor found inconvenient to diagnose. You could walk into a chemist's shop or a general store, or in many places simply buy it off a market stall. Until the Pharmacy Act of 1868 in Britain, it required no prescription, no doctor's approval. It cost at its cheapest about a penny for 20 or 25 drops, which meant it was not only accessible to the wealthy and the educated, it was accessible to everyone. Now here is where I want to pause, because I think it is important to resist 2 easy responses to this history. The first easy response is to mock it, to look back at the 19th century and say, how could educated people, physicians, parents recommend morphine to infants? The second easy response is to feel pure horror, to turn this into a simple story of negligence and harm. But the real story is more complicated than either, and more human, because the people giving laudanum to their children were not monsters. They were exhausted parents in a world with very few alternatives trying to keep their babies alive, in conditions where infant mortality was genuinely terrifying. They were physicians doing the best they could with the pharmacological knowledge available to them. They were operating within a medical tradition that stretched back thousands of years, in which the pain-relieving properties of opium were as established and respected as the pain-relieving properties of anything we have today. The tragedy is not that they were stupid. The tragedy is that nobody yet had the tools to understand what was actually happening inside those small bodies. The concept of addiction as a physiological disease, a real measurable change in the brain, did not exist yet. The idea that a substance could be simultaneously helpful and harmful, relief-giving and dependency-creating, was not yet part of medical thinking in any systematic way. They were not ignoring evidence. The evidence had not yet fully arrived. Which brings me to a small brown bottle that I keep thinking about. It was called Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. It was created around 1849, the invention at least in name of a woman who marketed herself as an old and experienced nurse, and it was aimed specifically at infants, at teething babies, at the desperate sleepless parents who would try anything. The label was charming. The advertisements showed mothers and babies in peaceful domestic settings. The tagline called it perfectly harmless. Medical professionals quoted in the promotional material called it a godsend. Each teaspoon contained 65 milligrams of morphine sulfate, plus a measure of alcohol. To put that in context, the recommended dose for a 6-month-old infant was 2 to 3 drops of laudanum, a significantly diluted preparation. 1 teaspoon of Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup contained the equivalent of 20 drops. 1 teaspoon, to a baby. Children fell asleep after taking it, of course. Some of them never woke up. Medical officers in Britain began documenting the deaths in the 1850s and 1860s. A physician named Thomas Bull estimated in 1854 that 3/4 of all recorded deaths from opium occurred in children under the age of 5. Court cases were reported. Doctors raised alarms in medical journals. From the 1860s onward, there were confirmed deaths in California, children slipping into comas after receiving the syrup, and yet the product remained on shelves. The morphine was not removed from the British formula until 1909, not removed from the American formula until 1915. The product itself continued to be sold in modified form until the 1930s. I find that timeline genuinely staggering. Not because the people selling it were villains, though some of them surely knew more than they admitted, but because of how long it takes for an idea to change, how long a trusted product can persist even when doubt begins to accumulate around it, how much inertia there is in what people believe to be safe. Does any of this sound familiar? I'll leave that question for you to sit with. But laudanum was not only a story of infants and medicine cabinets and working-class kitchens. It was also simultaneously a story about art, because the same substance that was quieting hungry babies in the slums of Manchester was also running through the veins of some of the most celebrated writers and poets of the English Romantic era. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the man who gave us some of the most mysterious and beautiful poetry in the English language, was a laudanum addict for most of his adult life. He began taking it as a young man of 19. A student at Cambridge prescribed it for rheumatic pain. He felt, as he later described it, immediate and total relief. His letters from this period are almost embarrassingly joyful about the experience. But the relief did not last. It never lasts. And Coleridge spent the rest of his life in a cycle that anyone who has studied addiction will recognize the desperation of need, the temporary relief of the dose, the shame, the withdrawal, the resolution to stop the relapse, the shame again. In 1814, at the height of his addiction, he was reportedly consuming by his own account somewhere around 8,000 drops of laudanum per day. 8,000. In the same letter where he calculated that number, he wrote to a friend, "I have in this one dirty business of laudanum 100 times deceived, tricked, and actually consciously lied. And yet all these vices are so opposite to my nature that but for this free agency annihilating poison, I verily believe I should have suffered myself to be cut in pieces rather than have committed any one of them." That sentence, I keep returning to it, because it is one of the most articulate early descriptions of what we now call the psychology of addiction. the gap between who a person is and who a substance makes them, the bewilderment of the self watching itself do things it would never choose to do. Coleridge said he wrote the poem Kubla Khan in a dream induced by laudanum coming out of what he called a profound sleep. 3 hours long visions of Xanadu rising in his mind, fully formed writing frantically until a visitor interrupted him and the dream dissolved. Whether that is literally true, scholars have debated for 2 centuries. But whether the opium gave him the poem or merely the context for it, the connection between laudanum and the romantic imagination was real and documented and complicated. 7 years after Coleridge's poem appeared, a young writer named Thomas de Quincey published anonymously in the pages of the London Magazine an account he titled Confessions of an English Opium Eater. De Quincey had first taken laudanum in 1804 at the age of 19 for rheumatic pain in his face. His description of that first experience is famous. He wrote in an hour, "Oh heavens, what a revulsion, what an upheaving from its lowest depth of the inner spirit. That my pains had vanished was now a trifle in my eyes. Here was a panacea for all human woes." The Confessions was an immediate sensation. It went through edition after edition. It was read across Europe and America. It influenced Edgar Allan Poe, Charles Baudelaire, and several other writers, who, reading De Quincey's seductive account, decided to try laudanum for themselves, and some of whom ended up in the same trap he described. Because De Quincey was not just celebrating the drug, he was documenting its full arc. The pleasures were real, and he wrote about them with an honesty that disturbed his contemporary critics. But the pains, the nightmares, the physical suffering of withdrawal, the slow dissolution of everything he had hoped to be were real too. He tried to stop, he wrote 3 major times. Each time he failed. He lived to the age of 74, which, given the circumstances, seems almost miraculous. What I find most striking about this chapter of medical history, and what I think gets lost when we turn it into a simple cautionary tale, is how much genuine relief these substances provided in a world that offered almost no alternatives. Before the 20th century, before modern anesthesia, before antibiotics, before anti-inflammatory medications, before the entire pharmacological revolution that reshaped what it means to be sick, pain was something you largely endured. Chronic pain. The pain of cholera. The pain of tuberculosis. The pain of childbirth. The pain of simply growing old in a body that medicine could not yet effectively treat. Into that world, laudanum arrived like something close to a miracle. It dulled pain that had no other dulling. It quieted coughs that would otherwise keep a sick person awake through the night. It managed diarrhea symptoms in a world where dysentery killed regularly. It offered at the cost of a penny a few hours of the absence of suffering. That is not nothing. That is, for many people in many moments, everything. The problem was never the relief. The problem was the price, the dependency, the slow realization building through the century that the thing giving relief was also over time taking something that couldn't be given back. And the particular cruelty of that realization was that it arrived not through obvious catastrophe, but through the accumulation of ordinary days. People didn't take laudanum and immediately fall apart. They took it and felt better, and then a little better still. And then they realized sometimes years later that the feeling better had quietly become the only way they felt anything at all. There is a phrase that haunts me a little from the medical literature of this era. Laudanum had a nickname, not given by doctors or pharmacists, but by the people who used it most heavily, the mothers of working-class Britain, who gave it not only to their sick children, but to healthy ones, who gave it so they could leave for work, so a neighbour or minder could manage a quiet baby for a few hours without being disturbed. They called it the poor child's nurse. That name says everything. It is tender and terrible at the same time. It tells you exactly how much these women were struggling, how little support existed, how desperate the logic became when you had to work 14 hours in a factory or a field and there was no one to hold your baby. The poor child's nurse. I don't know about you, but I find that phrase harder to sit with than almost anything else in this story. Not because it tells us how badly medicine failed, but because it tells us how badly everything else failed first. By the early 20th century, the landscape was beginning to shift. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 in the United States required that certain patent medicines list their ingredients. In 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act restricted the manufacture and distribution of opiates. Britain followed with the Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920. The brown bottles didn't disappear overnight. Laudanum continued to be available on prescription for decades, but the age of the freely available morphine and alcohol soothing syrup was ending. The idea that pain relief could be consequence-free, that a powerful substance could be given to a baby with a spoonful and a calm heart, that idea was finally slowly being revised. What replaced it was imperfect too. Medicine moved from one era of imperfect solutions to another. But at least the next era began with a slightly more honest accounting of what substances were actually doing inside human bodies. And that honest accounting leads us directly to our next stop on this journey, because the story of what medicine did to the human body in the name of healing is not only about things people swallowed. Some of the most dramatic interventions in history involved the blood itself. The idea that illness lived inside the blood, that if you simply removed enough of it, the illness would go with it, that a sick body could be emptied of its trouble and refilled with health. This belief lasted for over 2,000 years, and it was responsible for the deaths of some of the most famous people who ever lived. 2,400 years. That is not a typo. That is not an exaggeration. For roughly 2,400 years from the time of ancient Greece until the late 19th century, one of the most common things a doctor could do for a sick person was cut them open and let them bleed. Not as punishment, not out of cruelty, as medicine, as the best medicine available. And if you think that sounds horrifying, wait until you hear who it happened to. Let me take you to the night of December the 13th in the year 1799, Mount Vernon, Virginia. The former President of the United States, a man who had led an army through a revolution, survived smallpox, crossed the Delaware River in a winter storm, and lived through 8 years of commanding the most consequential military campaign in American history, woke up at 2 a.m. with a sore throat. His name was George Washington. He was 67 years old. He had ridden out the previous day in rain and snow and come home wet. By morning his throat was swollen and sore. His breathing was laboured. He was feverish. He asked specifically to be bled. Not because he was uninformed, not because he was desperate, because he'd been bled before in earlier illnesses and he believed it had helped. Because every physician he had ever consulted had told him this was correct. Because the entire medical establishment of his era on both sides of the Atlantic agreed that bloodletting was the appropriate treatment for inflammation. So at 7:30 in the morning, a man named George Rawlins, the estate's overseer, who was practiced in the technique, made an incision and removed the first measure of blood, about 12 to 14 ounces. Washington, still alert, told him to take more. Over the next 12 hours, 3 more physicians arrived. More blood was taken, and more again. By the end of the day, they had removed approximately 80 ounces, that is to say roughly 2.5 litres from the body of a man who was already struggling to breathe. 80 ounces. That is 40% of an adult's total blood volume drained in less than 16 hours. George Washington died that evening. He was gracious about it by all accounts. He thanked his doctors. He told them he was not afraid of death. He asked that his body not be placed in the vault for at least 3 days because he was afraid of being buried alive. And then he was gone. Modern physicians, looking back at his symptoms, the severe throat swelling, the difficulty breathing, the rapid deterioration, believe he most likely had a bacterial infection of the epiglottis, the small flap of tissue at the base of the tongue, a condition that is dangerous but treatable, a condition that with today's medicine he would almost certainly have survived. What he needed was antibiotics, and possibly a brief surgical procedure to open his airway. What he received from some of the best doctors in America was the removal of nearly half his blood. Now here is the question I always arrive at in this story, and it is not the one you might expect. The question is not how could they be so wrong. The question is how did this make sense for so long? How did intelligent, dedicated, careful physicians look at 2,000 years of accumulated medical tradition and conclude rationally, consistently across dozens of cultures and centuries that removing blood from a sick body was the path to recovery? To understand that you need to go back to the beginning, back to ancient Greece, back to a physician whose influence on Western medicine was so profound, so total, so long-lasting, that his ideas were still shaping treatment decisions in the 1940s, nearly 18 centuries after his death. His name was Galen. And in the 2nd century of the Common Era, he built the most comprehensive medical system the ancient world had ever seen. Galen lived in Rome during the reign of several emperors, eventually serving as personal physician to Marcus Aurelius. He was a prodigious observer, a tireless experimenter, and an absolutely formidable writer. He produced hundreds of medical texts. His understanding of anatomy was sophisticated. He was among the first to demonstrate clearly that arteries carry blood and not air, which had been seriously debated before his time. He pioneered dissection as a systematic tool for understanding the body. But his core theory of how the body worked was built on something older than himself, the doctrine of the four humours. The four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, were the foundational substances of ancient Greek medicine, associated with the four elements of earth, water, fire, and air, and with the four seasons. The theory held that human health was a matter of balance. Too much of any one humour or too little produced disease. The physician's job was to restore equilibrium, and Galen, being Galen, took this theory and systematized it with extraordinary precision. He created a complex calculus of bloodletting, how much to remove from which vein, at which time of year, in which age of patient for which presenting symptoms. He wrote treatises arguing for its use in fever, inflammation, mental disturbance, epilepsy, and dozens of other conditions. He linked specific veins to specific organs and prescribed local bleeding, removing blood from the arm, from the neck, from behind the ear, based on which organ he believed was in excess. His patients included some of the most powerful people in Rome. His methods were endorsed by the highest authorities in the empire. His books were copied, translated, argued over and taught in medical schools across Europe and the Arab world for well over 1,000 years. To question Galen was not simply to question a physician. It was to question an entire intellectual system that had been validated by centuries of apparent results. And here is where I want to pause, because I think this is the most important and underappreciated part of this story. Bloodletting appeared to work. Not always, not reliably, not by any mechanism we would now recognize as real. But when a physician bled a feverish patient and the patient's skin flushed less intensely afterward, it genuinely seemed to them that something had changed. When a patient with severe inflammation was bled, and appeared calmer often because they were now semi-conscious from blood loss, that calmness looked to the physician at the bedside like improvement. Some patients who were bled recovered. They would have recovered anyway from whatever illness they had. But the physician who bled them recorded the outcome as a success. Some patients who were bled worsened and died, but illness also kills people without any intervention. And in a world with no germ theory, no understanding of infection, no concept of what bacteria or viruses were, there was no reliable way to know which outcomes were caused by the treatment and which were caused by the disease. This is the human problem at the heart of medicine before evidence. You cannot easily separate the signal from the noise without a systematic way to compare outcomes. You cannot know if your treatment is helping without a controlled comparison. And in a world where controlled trials did not exist, the physician relied on experience tradition and pattern recognition, and patterns, when filtered through strong belief, have a way of confirming what you already think. By the 18th and early 19th centuries, bloodletting had reached something close to its absolute peak. A French physician named François-Joseph Victor Broussais, who was widely considered one of the great medical minds of his era, developed a theory that most diseases were caused by inflammation, and that inflammation could only be relieved by removing blood. He applied this theory with remarkable thoroughness. Broussais' preferred tool was not the lancet but the leech, the European medicinal leech Hirudo medicinalis, a small, elegant, deeply motivated creature that attaches to skin cuts a precise Y-shaped wound with 3 small jaws and drinks until satisfied. In 1833 alone, France imported 42 million leeches for medical use. 42 million in a single year. The shortage became so severe that the French government considered subsidizing leech breeding. There are records of Broussais applying up to 50 leeches to a single patient in a single day. 50 leeches. 1 patient. 1 day. I want to give you a moment to visualize that, and then I want to offer you some reassurance. We're going to move on from this image shortly. The leech craze spread across Europe and to America. London was importing approximately 7 million leeches a year at the height of the practice. Leeches were fashionable. Leeches were medical. Leeches were sold in pharmacies alongside tea and candles. And in the same era at medical schools across the Western world, students were taught the precise art of venesection, how to identify the correct vein, how to make a clean incision with the lancet, how to calculate the appropriate volume to remove based on the patient's age, constitution, the season, and the severity of symptoms. Some physicians even developed spring-loaded devices, the scarificator, that could make multiple parallel cuts simultaneously, delivering a more uniform and theoretically precise bleed. The man who began to truly dismantle all of this was a French physician named Pierre-Charles Alexandre Louis. Not with anger, not with ridicule, with something both simpler and more radical: numbers. In the 1820s and 1830s, Louis sat down with the hospital records of hundreds of patients and did something almost no one had done systematically before him. He counted, he compared, he tracked who had been bled early in their illness and who had been bled late. He tracked who survived and who did not. He looked at the data with the cool, somewhat merciless eye of someone who is genuinely curious about truth rather than interested in defending a tradition. What he found, published in 1835, was that patients who received bloodletting in the early days of pneumonia had a mortality rate of 44%. Patients who received bloodletting later after the critical window had a mortality rate of 25%. And the patients who were not bled at all did better still. The numbers did not say that bloodletting was completely useless in every context, but they said clearly and with data that the confidence physicians had placed in it was not supported by facts. Louis called his method the numerical method. We would recognize it today as the beginning of clinical epidemiology, the idea that medical decisions should be based on the systematic analysis of outcomes across groups of patients, not on tradition theory or the impressions of individual clinicians. He was not immediately celebrated for this. Many physicians pushed back hard. A treatment with 2,000 years of tradition behind it does not yield to a few hundred hospital records without a fight. But the door was open. Over the following decades, other physicians added their voices. A doctor named John Hughes Bennett presented statistics in 1855 showing that pneumonia patients who were not bled had a death rate of roughly 4% compared to 1 in 3 for those who were bled. A new understanding of disease germ theory developed by Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch in the latter half of the century finally gave medicine an alternative explanation for what inflammation actually was. Not humoral imbalance, microorganisms, bacteria, infection. Things that lived in the body and could not be drained away with the lancet or a leech. You cannot bleed out a bacterial infection. That sentence, once it could be understood, changed everything. By the end of the 19th century, bloodletting as a primary medical treatment was in rapid decline. A leading medical textbook, one originally written by the highly respected Canadian physician William Osler, removed bloodletting from its recommended treatments for most conditions. Though even Osler, writing in 1892, could not quite let go, noting somewhat wistfully that the profession had bled too much in the first half of the century, but had perhaps bled too little since. Too little, Dr. Osler. I keep returning to something about this story that I find genuinely moving. Not the bloodletting itself, though there is something haunting about George Washington, in his last hours gracious and calm and trusting, while his doctors did to him the very thing that was killing him. What moves me is the sheer persistence of the human desire to do something, to not stand helplessly by a suffering person, to pick up a tool, even a wrong tool, and act. The physicians who bled their patients were not sadists. They were people who cared, who had studied, who had been trained in a tradition that made by its own internal logic complete sense. And when their patient rallied even temporarily, even for the wrong reasons, they felt what all healers feel, the hope that they had helped. That hope, I think, is not so different from the hope that drives medicine today. We simply now have better ways of testing whether the hope is warranted. There is one more thing worth knowing about bloodletting's long legacy. Today, in the 21st century, a form of therapeutic phlebotomy, controlled removal of blood, is still used for a small number of specific conditions: hemochromatosis, where the body stores excess iron; polycythemia vera, where the body produces too many red blood cells. In those specific cases, draining blood actually works for real and measurable biological reasons. So even in the oldest, most discredited chapters of medical history, there is sometimes a small kernel of something genuine. A corner of the map that turns out, after all, to have been correctly drawn. And speaking of things that took a very long time to be properly understood, the next part of our journey takes us to a world that looks on the surface perfectly pleasant. Warm water, elegant architecture, wealthy visitors taking the air bathing in mineral springs, drinking prescribed amounts of a specific water drawn from a specific well. It looks like a holiday. But beneath the elegant surface of the Victorian spa town was one of the most peculiar chapters of medical belief in modern history, and one that in some unexpected ways actually delivered on its promises. Not always for the reasons anyone thought. But then, as we're beginning to discover, that is a recurring theme in the strange, tender human story of how we tried to heal each other. Picture this. You wake up at a grand hotel. Your room overlooks a park full of elm trees and manicured lawns. A maid brings you a glass of warm, slightly sulphurous water. It smells faintly of hard-boiled eggs, and tells you with complete seriousness that this is your 7 o'clock prescription. You're expected to drink 3 glasses before breakfast, walk slowly around the promenade for 45 minutes. Take a cold bath at 10, rest until noon, and then repeat the whole procedure in the afternoon. And you have paid a considerable amount of money for the privilege. This was not a punishment. This was a holiday. This was, for much of the Victorian era, the most fashionable and medically respectable thing a person of means could possibly do. Welcome to the world of the spa town, and welcome to one of the most fascinating chapters in the long history of medical belief. A chapter where the cure was elegant, the setting was beautiful, the theory was entirely wrong, and yet in ways nobody fully understood at the time, something about it actually worked. The idea that certain waters could heal the body is older than recorded history. Long before the Romans arrived in Britain in the year 43 of the Common Era, a local Celtic tribe had been gathering at a hot spring in what we now call Bath, worshipping a goddess named Sulis, whom they believed inhabited the waters. When the Romans came, they did not dismiss this. They built an elaborate bathing complex on the same site, the Aquae Sulis or Waters of Sulis, and blended their own goddess Minerva with the local deity, creating Sulis Minerva. The Romans understood, as most ancient cultures understood, that hot water rising naturally from the earth was remarkable, possibly sacred, almost certainly therapeutic. That instinct never really left Western civilization. It just kept changing clothes. By the late 18th century in England, Bath had become one of the most fashionable destinations in the country. The pump room and elegant assembly hall built directly over the ancient Roman spring had become a place not just for drinking prescribed waters, but for socializing, for being seen, for parading in one's best attire, alongside the aristocracy and the newly wealthy middle classes. Jane Austen wrote about Bath. Beau Nash, the great arbiter of Georgian social fashion, made it the social capital of England outside London. The waters were still prescribed, still drunk with solemn medical intent, but the ritual had acquired a kind of theatrical grandeur. I find this detail charming personally. The idea that you could simultaneously be taking your medicine and attending the best party in the country. There is something very human about that. We've always found ways to make the necessary pleasant, but it was in the Victorian era, roughly from the 1830s to the early 20th century, that the water cure reached its peak of both medical seriousness and popular obsession. The man most responsible for transforming mineral water drinking into a fully codified medical system was not a famous physician or a celebrated professor. He was a Silesian peasant farmer named Vincenz Priesnitz. Born in 1799 in what is now the Czech Republic, Priesnitz had no medical training whatsoever. What he had was an injury theory and an extraordinary amount of confidence. As a young man, Priesnitz was badly hurt in a cart accident, several broken ribs, significant internal bruising. He could not afford a doctor, so he devised his own treatment. He pressed cold, wet cloths against his injuries, drank large quantities of water and rested. He recovered, and he concluded with the unshakable logic of someone who has never been taught to question their own conclusions, that cold water was the cure for essentially everything. By the early 1830s, Priesnitz had converted his farm in Grafenberg into a residential treatment centre. Patients came from across Europe. Within a decade, he was treating hundreds of visitors a year, including aristocrats, military officers, and members of the educated professional classes. He had no medical degree, he had no license. He had cold water wet sheets and a confidence so absolute that it functioned as its own kind of medicine. The Priesnitz cure involved cold baths, cold showers, wet sheet wraps, vigorous walking in the mountain air, and drinking 6 to 8 glasses of cold spring water per day. It was uncomfortable in ways that are difficult to overstate. Patients were sometimes wrapped in soaking wet sheets and left for hours. The cold shower in an unheated stone building in Silesian winter was not described by any of its recipients as pleasant. And yet, they came, and came, and came. By the 1840s, the hydropathy movement, as it was now being called from the Greek words for water and treatment, had spread across England, Ireland, and the United States with the speed of something people genuinely wanted to believe in. Spa towns that already had mineral springs doubled down on their medical credentials. New hydropathic establishments were built specifically to offer the treatment. The railways made it possible for the middle classes to travel where previously only the wealthy could afford to go, and suddenly the water cure was not just for aristocrats. It was democratic. It was modern. It was the future of medicine. Malvern, a small town nestled in the Worcestershire Hills of England, became perhaps the most famous destination for the serious Victorian patient. Its water came from springs filtered through ancient granite rocks, extraordinarily pure, rich in minerals with essentially no dissolved impurities. In 1842, two physicians named James Wilson and James Gully opened the Malvern Water Cure establishment, and the town's transformation was swift and total. The names of the people who made their way to Malvern read like a who's who of Victorian intellectual and cultural life. Charles Darwin came to Malvern in 1849, suffering from what his own letters describe as years of stomach pain, nausea, vomiting, and profound exhaustion. He had tried conventional medicine without success. At Malvern, Dr. Gully put him on the full water cure regimen: cold baths, wet compresses, a strict diet, walking fresh air. No scientific work permitted. Darwin was by his own account astonished by the improvement. He wrote to a friend that his sickness had significantly eased and that he felt better than he had in years. He liked the treatment so much that he had a special outdoor shower and cold bath built at his home in Down, so he could continue the regimen himself. Florence Nightingale came to Malvern. Charles Dickens came. Alfred Lord Tennyson came and wrote about it in letters describing the experience as initially miserable and ultimately transformative. Queen Victoria, who did not travel to Malvern herself, reportedly insisted on having Malvern spring water bottled and sent to wherever she was residing on her royal tours. Let me pause here and ask you something, because I think this is genuinely one of the most interesting questions in this whole story. Were they wrong? Not about gout or cancer or smallpox. The conditions for which water was sometimes extravagantly prescribed were certainly not cured by mineral baths. But for Darwin, whose symptoms match what many modern physicians have retrospectively described as a severe anxiety and stress-related disorder, the enforced rest, the fresh mountain air, the complete prohibition on work, the daily gentle exercise, the removal from the pressures of London intellectual life, was this actually in some imprecise but real way good for him? I think the honest answer is yes, probably. Not because the water itself cured him, but because the entire structure of the Victorian spa experience imposed on the patient something that Victorian professional life systematically denied them: rest routine, fresh air, daily movement, and the social permission to stop working. You could not be productive at a spa. You were there to be treated. The doctor's prescription was your excuse to do nothing useful for weeks at a time. In an era with no understanding of stress physiology, no concept of what we would now call burnout, and a professional culture that equated productivity with moral virtue, the spa gave overworked, anxious, perpetually exhausted Victorian intellectuals official medical permission to simply stop. That, I would argue, was the real medicine, wrapped in the language of sulphur springs and cold sheets, but genuine nonetheless. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the American version of the spa craze was developing its own particular flavour, a combination of European hydropathy, evangelical health reform, and the sheer commercial energy of the Gilded Age. Saratoga Springs in upstate New York had been known for its mineral springs since the 18th century, when local indigenous people first brought European traders to the naturally carbonated waters. By the mid-19th century, it had become the most fashionable resort town in America. The Vanderbilts came, the Whitneys came, the banking families and the railroad magnates and the old New York aristocracy stayed at enormous hotels soaked in the mineral baths and drank from the springs in Congress Park, where elegant fountains dispensed water with names like Congress Spring and Columbian Spring, each carrying its own specific medical reputation, One promotional guide from the period described the Saratoga waters as the liquid vitamin pill of the Victorian era, and this description is in its own way surprisingly accurate. The mineral waters at Saratoga contain measurable amounts of sodium, magnesium, potassium, calcium, and bicarbonate. For visitors suffering from the effects of a diet heavy in meat and alcohol, and light in vegetables, which describe the eating habits of the wealthy Victorian classes, quite accurately drinking water rich in magnesium and potassium was not without genuine physiological effect. It was not medicine exactly, but it was not nothing. The town of Harrogate in North Yorkshire, England, occupied a uniquely strange position in this world, where Malvern had pure clean spring water and Bath had dramatic hot springs. Harrogate had something considerably less appealing. 88 different mineral springs within a very small area, many of them heavily laden with sulphur. The most famous of these, the Old Sulphur Well, had been known since 1571, when a man named William Slingsby literally tripped over it while walking across a field. The water tasted as even its most enthusiastic Victorian advocates acknowledged of rotten eggs. The smell was notable from a considerable distance. Harrogate's physicians turned this disadvantage into a selling point, with impressive commercial ingenuity. The sulphur, they explained, was the active ingredient. The more horrible the taste, the more powerfully the waters were cleansing your body of impurities. The discomfort was the treatment. If it was pleasant, it was not working. By the 1890s, when the town opened the royal baths, a palatial hydrotherapy complex built at a cost of £120,000, the equivalent of tens of millions in today's money, Harrogate was offering over 80 different treatments under one roof. There were Turkish baths, needle baths, peat baths, liver packs, electric douche baths, and something called the Harrogate Special Combination, which involved sequential shower wave ascending-descending and spinal douches administered in a specific order. In August of 1898 alone, the royal baths administered 18,723 individual treatments in a single month. 18,723 in 1 month, in one building. The spa town by this point had become an industry of extraordinary scale, and then the railways that had built the spa towns began very slowly to undo them. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th as germ theory took hold, and bacteriology and pharmaceutical medicine began delivering actual cures for actual diseases, the water cure found itself unable to compete. You could not cure tuberculosis with a mineral bath. You could not cure typhoid with a cold sheet wrap. The diseases that had sent desperate patients to the spa towns in search of anything that might help were now one by one yielding to treatments that work through mechanisms that could be measured and explained. The great hydropathic establishments of England went through a peculiar transition. Some became hotels, the grand buildings were simply too magnificent to demolish. Some became schools and colleges, others quietly closed. Harrogate's royal baths eventually became a restaurant and a tourist information centre, though its Victorian Turkish baths continued operating a small and atmospheric remnant of the original enormous establishment. But here is what I find most interesting about the spa town's legacy. We did not in the end abandon water therapy entirely. We renamed it. We repositioned it. We built scientific-sounding frameworks around the elements that actually worked hydrotherapy, for muscle recovery cold water immersion, for circulation mineral baths for skin conditions, and we discarded the more extravagant claims without throwing away the genuine benefits. The instinct, it turns out, was not wrong. It was just imprecisely aimed. There is something in the Victorian spa experience that I think is genuinely worth carrying with you as you drift off tonight. The patients who walked the promenades at Malvern or drank from the Congress spring fountains at Saratoga were not fools. They were people living in a world of profound uncertainty about disease, about what the body actually was, about what medicine could and could not do, and they found a practice that offered structure, community, rest, and the reassuring sense that something was being done, that they were not simply waiting to get better or get worse. That need for structure, for the ritual of care, for the feeling that the body is being attended to thoughtfully, is not a Victorian invention. It is as old as medicine itself. It is still with us. We just now have better water to drink it in. Of course, the Victorian era was not only obsessed with healing through water, it was obsessed with equal fervour and considerably less wisdom with healing through substances that we would now recognise as deeply dangerous. Substances that were not discovered in remote mountain springs or filtered through ancient granite. Substances that were synthesized in laboratories, purified, bottled and sold in beautiful glass containers with reassuring labels. Some were prescribed by the most eminent physicians of the age. Some were sold directly over pharmacy counters to anyone who could pay. Some were given to children. And some of them mercury, arsenic, and a handful of others were quite literally poison. There is a phrase that has survived from the 16th century, passed down through 400 years of medical and social history, so concise and so darkly accurate that it became one of the most famous sayings in the entire annals of medicine. One night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury. If you know what that means, you already have some idea of what this part of our story is about. If you don't, welcome. You're about to learn something remarkable about what doctors once considered an entirely reasonable prescription. Let us begin with Mercury. Not the planet, not the Roman god, but the heavy silver liquid metal that has fascinated, poisoned, and occasionally, just occasionally, genuinely helped human beings for somewhere in the neighbourhood of 3,000 years. Mercury in its natural state is extraordinary to look at. It is the only metal that is liquid at room temperature. It moves with an eerie, almost alive fluidity, pooling and splitting and rejoining itself like something that cannot quite decide what shape it wants to be. Ancient peoples found this quality mesmerizing and deeply suggestive of power. The Chinese called it quicksilver. The Egyptians buried it in tombs. The Emperor Qin Shi Huang of China, the man who built the Great Wall and commissioned the Terracotta Army, reportedly consumed it in pill form, administered by his physicians as the key to immortality. He died at 49. His physicians, the historical record suggests, survived him considerably. But Mercury's real moment as a medical substance came not in ancient China, but in Europe at the end of the 15th century, when a new and catastrophic disease arrived on the continent with the speed and ferocity of something that had been waiting a very long time. The disease we now call syphilis appeared in Europe by most historical accounts in the final years of the 1400s. It arrived explosively, sweeping through populations with a severity that shocked even a continent that had lived through the Black Death. In its early phases, it caused skin ulcers, rashes, fevers, and lesions that could be frankly disfiguring. In its late phases, without treatment, it attacked the nervous system and the brain. Physicians were desperate. They had no germ theory. They had no understanding of bacterial infection. They had only the tools of humoral medicine and a handful of plant and mineral substances that had been used for various ailments over the preceding centuries. And someone at some point in the early 16th century decided to try mercury. The physician most associated with systematizing mercury's use for syphilis was Paracelsus, the brilliant, cantankerous, deeply eccentric Swiss-German physician who scandalized his era by publicly burning the works of Galen and insisting that medicine should be based on direct observation rather than ancient authority. Paracelsus had a gift for seeing things others missed. He also had a gift for being thoroughly right about some things and spectacularly wrong about others. His insight about mercury was in a strange and limited way not entirely wrong. Mercury is antimicrobial. It poisons living organisms, including bacteria. If you happen to administer it in exactly the right dose to a patient at exactly the right stage of infection, it was just barely possible that it might kill enough of the bacteria causing the disease without killing the patient too. This happened probably a few times. Those recoveries were remembered and celebrated. What was not fully reckoned with was that the line between a therapeutic dose of mercury and a lethal dose of mercury was extraordinarily narrow, and that even doses that did not kill immediately caused profound cumulative body-wide damage over time. The standard mercury treatment for syphilis in the 16th through the 19th centuries was one of the more unpleasant experiences that a patient could be asked to endure in the name of medicine. The most straightforward method was mercury ointment rubbed vigorously into the skin on the limbs, the torso, the neck repeatedly over weeks or months. The patient was kept in a heated room near a fire to encourage sweating. The idea was that the disease understood in humoral terms as a kind of poison in the blood would be expelled through the skin along with perspiration. There was also fumigation. The patient sat in an enclosed wooden box or cabinet, with only their head protruding while mercury was heated below them, and they inhaled the vapours. There were mercury pills, there were mercury elixirs, there were in later centuries mercury injections and mercury douches. The side effects were extensive and devastating. Mercury poisoning produces, among other things, excessive salivation, and I mean that quite literally. A patient at a therapeutic mercury dose could produce, according to the physician, Paracelsus up to 3 pints of saliva per day. This was not considered a side effect to be concerned about. It was considered proof that the treatment was working. The poison physicians believed was being expelled through the saliva, carrying the disease out of the body with it. Let me repeat that because I want to make sure it lands properly. 3 pints of saliva per day. And the doctors saw that and thought, excellent, it is working. What was actually happening was mercury toxicity, and the further consequences were considerably worse than the salivation. Patients developed gum disease, loose teeth, mouth ulcers. In severe cases, the jawbone itself began to decay, causing holes to open in the cheek. Tremors appeared in the hands and legs. Personality changed. Mercury poisoning produces a specific neurological syndrome now called mercurial erethism, characterized by profound anxiety, pathological shyness, depression, irritability, and memory disturbance. Hat makers who used mercury in the felting process developed the same cluster of symptoms so reliably that it entered the language as a fixed phrase. You may know it. We called it and still call it Mad Hatter's disease. Does this remind you of a character from a famous story? It should. When Lewis Carroll created the Mad Hatter for Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in 1865, he was drawing on something his readers would have recognized immediately. The erratic, trembling, socially awkward Hatter was not merely a whimsical invention. He was a recognizable figure from Victorian professional life, the damaged hat maker shaking with mercury poisoning, carrying the entire sorry history of an occupational hazard in every one of his mannerisms. Art, as it often does, preserved the historical truth long after the medical profession had moved on. Meanwhile, mercury was not only being used for syphilis. By the 19th century, a mercury compound called calomel mercurous chloride had become what one historian aptly described as the aspirin of its age. And I mean that in the fullest, most alarming sense of the comparison. Calomel was prescribed for constipation, typhoid fever, cholera, bronchitis, influenza, tuberculosis, gout mumps, epilepsy, cancer, ingrown toenails, and extraordinarily teething in infants. It was marketed in 2 forms, a blue pill and a blue massa paste that could be administered orally absorbed through the skin or inhaled as vapor. Neither form came with any standardized dose. There was no reliable way to know how much mercury any given preparation actually contained. The physician who became perhaps the most vigorous champion of calomel's use was none other than Benjamin Rush, the same physician we met in an earlier chapter, the signer of the Declaration of Independence, the founder of American psychiatry, the passionate advocate of bloodletting for yellow fever. Rush coined the term heroic dose to describe calomel administration of approximately 20 grains, about 1 1/3 grams taken 4 times daily. He believed that the more violent the body's response to the medicine, the more powerfully the disease was being purged. During the Civil War, calomel was so widely used in the Union Army's medical corps that the United States Surgeon General William Hammond, in a remarkable act of institutional courage in 1863, officially banned its use. The response from the medical establishment was furious. Hammond was accused of exceeding his authority, of undermining the practice of medicine, of depriving soldiers of the one medicine that reliably produced visible results. He was eventually removed from his position for this and other reasons, though his removal was later reversed. The soldier patients continued to receive calomel. I want to tell you about a woman you may know from a very different context. Louisa May Alcott, the author of Little Women, the woman who created Jo March and gave generations of readers a heroine who refused to be diminished, served as a nursing volunteer for the Union Army in 1862 and 1863, caring for wounded soldiers at a hospital in Washington. She contracted typhoid fever while there. Her physicians treated her with calomel. She never fully recovered her health. For the rest of her life, she died in 1888. She suffered from skin rashes, joint pain, gastrointestinal problems, and a general fragility that she attributed in her private letters to the mercury treatment she had received. Modern medical historians have largely agreed with her own assessment. The woman who wrote about a family of girls learning to be courageous, kind, and true spent the second half of her life managing the quiet, persistent consequences of what her doctors had prescribed to save her. But mercury was not the only dangerous substance making its way through Victorian medicine and Victorian daily life in the respectable clothing of a prescription. Arsenic was in its own way even more peculiar, because arsenic had not one life in the 19th century but 2. It was simultaneously a medicine and a beauty product. The medical use of arsenic was codified by a British physician named Thomas Fowler, who in 1786 published his findings on a preparation he called liquor mineralis, a flavoured solution containing 1% potassium arsenite. Introduced into the London Pharmacopoeia in 1809, Fowler's solution became over the following decades a standard prescription for an extraordinary range of conditions: malaria, asthma, psoriasis, eczema, rheumatism, tuberculosis, epilepsy, and syphilis, among others. It was prescribed for periods of months and sometimes years. Patients were given increasing doses, the physician watching carefully for signs of toxicity, puffy eyelids, loosening bowels, and then backing down slightly when those signs appeared. This was considered precise, responsible dosing. What it actually produced in patients who received it over extended periods was chronic arsenic poisoning, characteristic dark spots on the skin, thickening and cracking of the palms and feet, nerve damage, and eventually a significantly elevated risk of skin cancer. And now for the part of this story that I confess I find genuinely difficult to process, even knowing what I know about the history of medicine. In the 1850s, reports began circulating in European and American medical and popular press about a remarkable practice in Styria, a region of what is now Austria, where peasant farmers were apparently eating arsenic deliberately. Not as medicine exactly, but for beauty. The arsenic eaters of Styria, as they were called, believed that small regular doses of arsenic gave them energy, improved their breathing at high altitude, and above all gave them smooth, plump, clear, translucent complexions. A Swiss physician named Johann Jakob von Tschudi published a report on them in 1851 describing their glowing skin and apparent vitality with barely concealed admiration. He did note with some understatement that the practice tended to end badly over the long term. His phrase, and I find this striking, was that most arsenic eaters end with an inevitable infirmity of the body. This report swept through European and American popular culture like a fashion trend. Within years, arsenic had acquired a glamorous reputation it had absolutely no business having. By 1890, an American advertiser who may have invented a fictional doctor entirely was selling tins of what were labelled Dr. Campbell's safe arsenic complexion wafers, described as guaranteed absolutely safe and harmless to anybody. A competing product sold through the Sears and Roebuck catalogue, which in that era served something like the role of an online marketplace delivering products to households across the country, offered Dr. Rose's arsenic complexion wafers, promising to clear freckles, blackheads, pimples, and all facial disfigurements. Women nibbled them like breath mints. Some washed their faces with arsenic-based soaps. Some, inspired by the Styrian stories, bathed in mineral springs they hoped were arsenic-rich. The skin would sometimes briefly appear to improve arsenic dews affect skin cell behavior, and small doses can temporarily suppress certain inflammatory skin conditions. So there was just enough real effect to sustain the belief, just enough visible result to bring the next customer through the door. And beneath that visible effect, the arsenic was accumulating, slowly, steadily, invisibly. I want to pause here and ask you something honest. When you hear these stories, the calomel given to infants, the arsenic wafers marketed as harmless, the mercury rubbed into syphilitic patients for months while their teeth fell out, what is the emotion you feel? I think for most of us the instinctive response is some combination of horror and a kind of distant superiority, a sense of how could they not have known, how could they have trusted these things? But here is what I keep returning to every time I go deeply into this history. The people who took these substances were not naive. They were not uninformed about the general concept of poison arsenic, was notorious as a murder weapon throughout the Victorian era. Women used it to kill inconvenient husbands. Everyone knew it was toxic. The arsenic wafers said so right on the label. The mercury treatment produced symptoms so obvious that physicians codified them, tracked them, and used them as dosing guides. What people trusted was not the substance, it was the framework. The idea that a physician or a scientist or a respectable advertiser had done the necessary work to establish that this particular dose in this particular form was safe enough, that someone with authority had drawn the line between poison and medicine, and that they were safely on the right side of it. That trust in expertise in authority and the idea that someone responsible is checking is not a Victorian peculiarity. It is the foundation of how most of us navigate a world too complex to evaluate entirely on our own. The difference between their era and ours is not the trust. It is the quality of the evidence that the experts had to work with. Calomel, the blue pill, the blue mass, the heroic medicine of the American Civil War, was finally removed from the standard United States pharmacopoeia in 1950. Teething powders containing mercury were sold in Britain until 1948, when an epidemic of what doctors called pink disease, icy, swollen, intensely itchy red hands and feet in infants, was finally traced to its cause. It had been mercury all along. Fowler's solution, the arsenic tonic, did not formally disappear from the United States pharmacopoeia until 1950, and small amounts were still being produced in certain countries well into the 1970s. These were not ancient practices. These were substances prescribed by living physicians given to living patients, sold in pharmacies, with proper labels within the lifetimes of people's grandparents. There is one final strange footnote to this story that I find genuinely moving in its unexpected elegance. In the early years of the 20th century, A German physician named Paul Ehrlich spent years systematically testing hundreds of chemical compounds, looking for what he called a magic bullet, a substance that would kill a specific disease-causing organism without destroying the patient's body along with it. He and his Japanese colleague Sahachiro Hata tested compound after compound. On the 606th try in 1909 they found it. The compound was an arsenic derivative. It killed the bacterium that caused syphilis. It was the first targeted antimicrobial drug in history. Ehrlich called it salvarsan, the same element that had been rubbing patients raw in ointment form for 4 centuries, the same element being nibbled in wafer form for a clearer complexion, turned out in exactly the right molecular configuration, at exactly the right dose targeting exactly the right organism to actually work. Paracelsus, standing in the 16th century with his conviction that only the dose makes the poison, had not been entirely wrong. He had just been working with tools far too crude to find the dose that mattered, and now, having walked through the shadow side of the medicine cabinet through mercury and arsenic, through substances that helped and harmed in roughly equal measure, it is time to consider the people who stood outside the formal medical system entirely. Not the physicians with their licenses and their anatomical training. Not the apothecaries with their glass jars and careful measures, but the men who travelled from town to town with a wagon and a crowd and a bottle of something that they claimed would cure everything guaranteed or your money back. The patent medicine era was coming, and with it some of the most extraordinary, most creative and most spectacularly dishonest salesmanship in the history of human commerce. Somewhere in a small American town in the late 1880s, let's say it is a Tuesday, and it is warm and the dust from the main road has settled into a fine golden haze, something unusual happens. A wagon pulls into the square. Not an ordinary wagon. This one is painted in colours you don't normally see on a Tuesday, deep red and gold, with lettering across the side that promises in elaborate script relief from pain restoration of vitality and the cure of ailments too numerous to fully list. Mounted on the back of the wagon is a small platform, and on the platform a man in a top hat is already talking before the horses have fully stopped. He has a voice like a river in spring wide and unstoppable, and carrying everything along with it. He has a medical degree from a university that may or may not exist. He has in the boxes stacked behind him somewhere between 300 and 1,000 bottles of something called a remedy. And he has before the crowd that has gathered in the next 20 minutes an extraordinary story to tell. This is the medicine show, and for a few decades in American history it was one of the most vivid, most shameless, and in ways that will take us a little while to fully appreciate most fascinating intersections between commerce, theatre, medicine, and human hope that this country ever produced. To understand the patent medicine era properly, you have to start with a question that the history books don't always ask. Why did people buy this stuff? Not in a dismissive way, not as a way of implying that they were foolish or easily deceived, but genuinely what need were these products meeting? What gap in the world were they filling so successfully that by the year 1900, the patent medicine industry in the United States had become an $80 million business? The answer, I think, requires understanding what medicine actually looked like for most ordinary Americans in the second half of the 19th century. If you lived on a farm in Kansas or on the outer edges of a mill town in Pennsylvania, a trained physician was not necessarily easy to reach. The journey might take hours. The fee when you got there was not trivial, and when you arrived what you might receive, as we have been tracing all evening, was bloodletting, calomel, a cold shower, or a bottle of something containing opium and alcohol and very little else of substance. The difference between what a licensed physician could offer and what a travelling salesman could offer was in practical terms not always as large as we might imagine. Meanwhile, a brightly labelled bottle on the shelf of the general store cost 25 cents. It required no appointment. It came with its claims printed right on the label, and if it contained alcohol and opium, which a remarkable number of them did, it genuinely made you feel better, at least in the short term. The term patent medicine is fittingly something of a fraud in itself. Most of these products were not patented. Patenting a medicine required revealing its formula, which was the last thing any manufacturer wanted to do. Instead, they trademarked the names and the labels and kept the actual ingredients a closely guarded commercial secret. This secrecy was simultaneously a marketing strategy and a legal protection. It prevented competitors from copying the formula, while also making it nearly impossible for consumers to know what they were actually swallowing. What they were typically swallowing when the industry was eventually examined systematically was a combination of alcohol, opium, or morphine, or heroin plant extracts, and occasionally cocaine, all in proportions carefully calibrated, not to cure anything in particular, but to produce a reliably pleasant effect. A product called Hostetta's Stomach Bitters, one of the most popular remedies of the Civil War era, and after contained 44% alcohol. To put that in context, that is stronger than most wines and approaching the strength of standard spirits. It was marketed as a medicine for digestive complaints. Its army of loyal consumers, many of them women living in temperance communities, where open drinking was socially unacceptable, were effectively consuming hard liquor with medical permission. The machinery that made this industry so spectacularly successful was not the medicine. It was the advertising. Patent medicine manufacturers were without question the greatest advertising innovators of the 19th century. They pioneered techniques that we now consider entirely ordinary, but that were in their era completely new national newspaper campaigns, free samples, promotional giveaways, celebrity endorsements, testimonial letters, money-back guarantees, and what we would now call direct mail marketing. When the Lydia Pinkham Company, makers of the famous vegetable compound for women's health, was spending 78% of its gross revenue on advertising in the year 1882, up to $1 million a year in advertising budgets by the early 20th century, it was not because the product was difficult to make. It was because the company understood something fundamental. The medicine was almost beside the point. What you were really selling was belief. Let me tell you about Lydia Pinkham herself, because she is one of the genuinely interesting figures in this story. Lydia Estes Pinkham was born in Massachusetts in 1819, and in her private life she was a serious woman, a teacher, a temperance advocate, an abolitionist, and a genuine home herbalist, who mixed remedies for neighbours and kept meticulous case notes about what seemed to help. Her vegetable compound began as something she gave away. It was the financial crisis of 1873 which wiped out the family's savings and left them desperate that pushed her sons to begin selling it commercially. The compound itself was a mixture of plant extracts including black cohosh fenugreek and unicorn root, all dissolved in about 18% alcohol. It was marketed for what was called female complaints menstrual pain, the symptoms of menopause fatigue, and the broad 19th century diagnosis of hysteria. Her face appeared on every bottle and on every advertisement, and the company encouraged women to write directly to her for personal advice about their health. Here is the part that makes this story more complicated than a simple tale of fraud. Lydia Pinkham actually answered those letters personally for years. She gave genuine advice. She sometimes told women to see a doctor. She addressed with real care and attention health problems that the formal medical establishment of her era largely ignored or dismissed as emotional weakness. The male-dominated medical profession, which had almost nothing effective to offer women for the conditions she was targeting, denounced her product as quackery, while prescribing their own remedies that were often no more effective and considerably more dangerous. When she died in 1883, her sons continued using her image on the bottles and answering letters in her name, a piece of posthumous marketing that has always struck me as equal parts brilliant and deeply unsettling. Women wrote for decades to a woman who had been dead for years and received helpful replies, and then there was Clark Stanley. If Lydia Pinkham occupies the complicated middle ground of the patent medicine world, part genuine healer, part commercial enterprise, part marketing genius, Clark Stanley occupies the far shining end of pure spectacle. Stanley styled himself the Rattlesnake King. He had by his own account spent years learning the secrets of snake oil from a Hopi medicine man in Arizona. Whether this story had any basis in reality is, to put it charitably, unclear. What was not unclear was his showmanship. In 1893, at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the great World's Fair that drew over 27 million visitors and was one of the defining cultural events of the Gilded Age, Clark Stanley set up a demonstration. He reached into a bag. He pulled out a live rattlesnake. He killed it on the spot, boiled it in front of the crowd, and produced from the boiling water a greasy liquid that he immediately bottled-labeled and began selling as Clark Stanley's snake oil liniment, good for rheumatism, neuralgia, sciatica, sore throat, toothache sprains, and any number of other complaints. The crowd was riveted. The bottles sold. In 1916, following the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act, the federal government finally got around to testing a shipment of Stanley's product that had crossed state lines. They analysed it carefully in a laboratory. They found it contained mineral oil, a small amount of beef, tallow-capsaicin from chili peppers, turpentine and camphor. No snake oil of any kind, not even close. He had been boiling beef in water and selling the result as a rattlesnake cure. His fine, when found guilty of misbranding, was $20. That is roughly equivalent to about $600 today. He had made over the course of his career a considerable fortune. Now, I want to complicate this story slightly because I think the full truth is more interesting than the simple version. Snake oil, actual snake oil extracted from actual snakes, is not entirely without biological basis. Chinese labourers who came to the American West to build the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s brought with them a traditional remedy made from Chinese water snake oil, which they used on aching joints. Modern biochemical analysis of Chinese water snake oil has found it to contain omega-3 fatty acids at levels comparable to, or even exceeding those in fish oil compounds, with genuine anti-inflammatory properties. The workers shared this remedy with the Americans around them, which seeded the idea that snake oil was a valid cure for joint pain. Clark Stanley then built an empire on the concept, while substituting a completely different product. The original idea was not fraudulent. The American version of it was. This pattern, a genuine kernel of traditional knowledge captured and hollowed out by commercial machinery, sold back to the public as something it no longer was, is, I would argue, one of the defining narratives of the patent medicine era. By 1900, there were over 50,000 different patent medicines on the American market. 50,000. The industry was spending $10 million a year on newspaper advertising alone, so much that many newspapers had become financially dependent on the revenue and refused to print critical coverage of the products for fear of losing the income. Some of the products were simply useless alcohol and water bottled optimistically. Some contained genuine botanical extracts with real, if modest, effects, and some were genuinely dangerous, heavily laced with morphine, heroin, or cocaine, producing powerful relief and reliable addiction in equal measure. One of the most effective products at this end of the market was simply laudanum with a new label. We have already met laudanum back in part 3 of our story. The genius of the patent medicine era was to take the same substance, opium dissolved in alcohol, dress it in fresh packaging, give it a respectable sounding name and call it a nerve tonic, or a women's remedy, or a children's soothing preparation, thereby separating it from its already troubled reputation and starting fresh. The unravelling when it came was driven not by government action, but by journalism. In the autumn of 1905, a writer named Samuel Hopkins Adams began publishing a series of articles in a popular magazine called Collier's Weekly. He called the series The Great American Fraud, and it was by the standards of the era sensational. Adams had done something nobody had done systematically. Before he had sent products to chemists for analysis, he had tracked the actual ingredients of the most popular remedies, and he had documented with names, with numbers, with specific cases the harm that was being done. He calculated that Americans were spending $75 million a year on patent medicines, and wrote in his opening lines that in exchange for this sum, the country was swallowing enormous quantities of alcohol, an appalling amount of opiates and narcotics, and in excess of all other ingredients, undiluted fraud. The articles ran through early 1906. By that summer, Congress had passed and President Theodore Roosevelt had signed the Pure Food and Drug Act, the first federal law requiring accurate ingredient labeling on food and medicine, and the first to prohibit the interstate sale of adulterated or misbranded products. It was not a complete solution. The law required listing narcotics on labels but did not prohibit their use. It did not regulate advertising claims. Many manufacturers simply kept selling the same products with smaller print. But it was the beginning of the end for the most egregious era of medical fraud in American history, and it established for the first time the principle that the government had not just the right but the responsibility to protect citizens from being lied to about what they were consuming in the name of their health. I find myself sitting with a particular feeling at the end of this story that I want to try to put into words honestly, because I think the easy version of the patent medicine era is a story of cynical fraudsters preying on ignorant people, and that version feels satisfying but not quite true. The people who bought these medicines were not ignorant. They were in many cases people who had watched formal medicine fail them, fail to explain what was wrong, fail to offer anything that helped fail, even to take their suffering seriously. They turned to patent medicines not because they couldn't tell truth from fiction, but because truth and fiction were genuinely hard to separate in a world without consumer protection, without ingredient disclosure, without systematic evidence, without any reliable way to know whether the claims on the bottle had any basis in reality. What they lacked was not intelligence, it was information. And the moment information became available, the moment a journalist with access to a chemistry laboratory published what was actually in the bottles, the market began to change. Which brings us in a way that feels almost inevitable from where we've been standing all evening, to the women who did not wait for journalists to tell them what worked. While the medicine show wagons were rolling through town, and the patent medicine advertisements were covering the back pages of every newspaper, there was a parallel system of medicine operating quietly in millions of homes across the Western world. No wagons, no top hats, no printed testimonials, just women in kitchens and gardens and storerooms doing what women had been doing for centuries, measuring, mixing, watching carefully, adjusting the dose, remembering what had worked before and what had made things worse, keeping sometimes in writing and sometimes only in memory a pharmacopoeia that no university had ever certified and no government had ever regulated, but that had across generations of practical use accumulated exactly the kind of evidence that the medicine shows conspicuously lacked. That story, quiet and largely unrecorded, is where we are headed next. There is a sentence I keep coming back to from a 17th century English aristocrat named Sir Ralph Verney. Writing to his wife in 1647 about their ailing child, he advised her, and I want you to notice how casually he wrote this as though it were the most obvious thing in the world, to give the child no medicine, but such as midwives and old women with the doctor's approval do prescribe, for they by experience know better than any physician how to treat such infants. A nobleman in the 17th century telling his wife to trust the old women over the doctors, and he was not wrong. For most of human history, medicine did not live in universities or hospitals or laboratories. It lived in kitchens, it lived in gardens, it lived in the careful hands and the long memories of women who had watched illness move through families for decades, who knew which plant reduced a fever and which one eased a labouring mother's contractions, who understood from observation, from repetition, from the quiet accumulation of evidence gathered one bedside at a time, how the body responded to treatment in ways that no textbook in existence had yet organised into print. These women were not practising anything less than medicine. In many cases, they were practicing something considerably more sophisticated than what their credentialed male counterparts were offering, and the story of how they were systematically dismissed, and the story of what was lost in that dismissal, and the story of what science eventually found its way back to that, is what this part is about. Let me begin with a woman whose name most people have never heard in a country house in Northamptonshire in England sometime in the late 1600s. Her name was Lady Grace Mildmay, and when she died in 1620 she left behind 250 folios of medical writings, detailed methodical, painstakingly organised descriptions of how to prepare and dispense herbal and chemical medicines for the members of her household and for the people of her community. Recipes that included specific quantities, observations about what worked and what did not, instructions on timing, preparation, storage. One of her most complex preparations, a general-purpose healing balm, required mixing 13 pounds of sugar and nuts with 159 different seeds, spices and roots in 8 gallons of oil, wine and vinegar. The recipe alone runs to multiple pages. It is not the work of someone dabbling. It is the work of someone who had spent decades refining a practice, discarding what failed and recording what succeeded, building something that functioned in its own way as a pharmaceutical compendium. And she was not unusual. Not in the circles of women with the means and the literacy to record what they knew. Elizabeth Freke, born in Norfolk in 1641, maintained an inventory of over 400 home remedies and kept her 200 bottles of medicine under lock and key, as carefully as any apothecary's shop. Over the course of her life, Lady Johanna St. John compiled an alphabetical reference of medical remedies in a small leather-bound notebook, organised, indexed, arranged for practical use. These notebooks and household recipe collections moved through families as treasured heirlooms. They were copied and exchanged among networks of women who shared knowledge about plants and illness, the way other people share knowledge about cooking or farming, because the survival of the people around them depended on it. The philosopher Francis Bacon, who was not as a rule given to sentimentality about women's capacities, wrote that old women were more happy many times in their cures than learned physicians. His contemporary Thomas Hobbes said he would rather take his advice from an experienced old woman who had been at many sick people's bedsides than from the learnedest but inexperienced physician. These were not romantic compliments. They were practical assessments from men who'd observed both kinds of medicine at work. What made the women's knowledge different from the formal medicine of their era? A few things, I think, and I want to be careful here to be accurate rather than simply celebratory. The women's tradition was overwhelmingly plant-based. It drew on centuries of accumulated observation about which plants produced which effects in the human body. Much of this knowledge was empirical in the truest sense, built from direct experience, not from theoretical frameworks. It was also by necessity conservative. A woman whose remedies harmed her children or her neighbours would not be consulted again. The consequences of failure were immediate and personal, in a way that the consequences of a physician's failure, protected by professional authority and the complexity of illness, often were not. The formal medical tradition, as we've traced throughout this evening, was built primarily on theory. The theory of the four humours, the doctrine of Galen, the belief that the body was a system of flows and balances to be managed through evacuation. The practical results of this theory, bloodletting calomel mercury ointments, heroic purges, were interventions that frequently made patients worse. The kitchen pharmacy, by contrast, was built on observation. It was built on the question, does this help, and how much? That question, asked repeatedly across generations by women who had no framework to impose on the answer, produced a body of knowledge that was in some respects closer to what we now call evidence-based medicine than anything the universities were teaching. Now, and this is where the story gets genuinely interesting, let me tell you about foxglove. The foxglove plant Digitalis purpurea grows wild across the English Midlands and into Wales. It is a tall, dramatic plant, its stalks rising sometimes 5 feet high, hung with deep purple bell-shaped flowers. It is unmistakably beautiful. It is also in the wrong dose highly toxic. For centuries, the records reach back to at least 1250 in the writings of a Welsh family known as the Physicians of Midvi folk healers had been using preparations from foxglove leaves to treat a condition they called dropsy. Dropsy was the old name for what we now understand as edema, the alarming painful accumulation of fluid in the body's tissues that accompanied severe heart failure. Patients with dropsy swelled dramatically. Their legs, their abdomens, their faces all would fill with fluid as their failing hearts could no longer pump blood efficiently through the body. The women healers who treated dropsy with foxglove tea knew it worked. They did not know why. They did not need to know why. They knew how much to give, learned through years of careful observation about where the line between treatment and toxicity lay. They knew when to stop. They knew which patients benefited. In 1776, a physician named William Withering encountered a patient with dropsy who'd been given up to die. She recovered not under his care, but after taking a folk preparation that someone else had given her. Intrigued, Withering tracked down the source of the remedy and identified the plant it was built around. Then he did something remarkable. He spent the next 10 years systematically testing it, recording every patient, documenting outcomes, mapping the relationship between dose and effect with a precision that was unusual for his era. In 1785, he published his findings. Of 156 patients treated with foxglove preparations, over 100 experienced significant relief from their symptoms. He described the correct dosage, which turned out to be only slightly less than the dose used in modern digoxin tablets. He described the symptoms of toxicity and how to avoid them. He described which patients were likely to benefit and which were not. The drug we now call Digitalis, still prescribed today for certain kinds of heart failure, still derived from the foxglove plant using essentially the same extraction methods. Withering described entered formal medicine from an unnamed woman's folk recipe. Withering himself was quite honest about this. He acknowledged in print that the knowledge had come from traditional herbalist practice. He framed his contribution not as discovery but as verification the knowledge already existed. What he added was the systematic documentation that allowed it to be used more safely and more reliably. That honesty is worth noting because it was not universal. The history of medicine is full of cases where knowledge that originated in folk tradition, often women's tradition, was absorbed into formal medicine without acknowledgement, or was actively dismissed until a credentialed male practitioner rediscovered it independently and then received the credit. The plants that household women were quietly working with across the centuries turn out, when examined with modern pharmacological tools, to contain a remarkable proportion of genuinely active compounds. Willow bark brewed as a tea for fever and pain, a remedy used by ordinary women across Europe for generations, contains salicin, a compound that the body converts to salicylic acid. Aspirin is a derivative of salicylic acid. The active ingredient was isolated and synthesized into a stable pharmaceutical form by German chemists in 1899. The folk remedy that preceded it by uncountable generations was doing the same biological work through a cruder but functionally similar mechanism. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye, was used by midwives to accelerate labour and reduce postpartum bleeding. The male medical establishment dismissed this as dangerous folklore. The practice was condemned. What the midwives had identified through observation of outcomes over generations was that ergot contains alkaloids that powerfully stimulate uterine contractions. Ergot derivatives are the principal pharmaceutical agents used today in obstetrics to manage labour and prevent postpartum hemorrhage. Chamomile for stomach upset, valerian for sleep, echinacea for immune support, St. John's wort for low mood, elderflower for fever. Some of these traditional uses have held up under rigorous scientific examination, some have not. But the persistence of the list, its length, its overlap with the modern pharmacopoeia, the fact that so many of these plants contain exactly the classes of compounds that would produce the effects the women were describing is not coincidence. It is the residue of a very long, very careful, very unacknowledged experiment. I want to stop and ask you something because I think it is worth sitting with for a moment. Have you ever had a grandmother or a mother or an aunt or a neighbour, someone from an older generation who had a remedy for something, a particular tea for a cold, a compress for an injury, a specific way of preparing food for someone who was sick? Something that was passed down through the family without any scientific explanation, but that seemed from your own experience to simply work. I think most of us have. And I think most of us have also at some point smiled at these remedies in a slightly condescending way, chalked them up to placebo or tradition or superstition, or just the affectionate habits of older women who didn't know better. What this history suggests is that the condescension may have had it somewhat backwards. The systematic exclusion of women from formal medicine began in earnest in the high medieval period, accelerated in the early modern era, and was essentially complete by the 19th century. The mechanisms were multiple. Universities which controlled access to medical credentials did not admit women. The guilds of apothecaries and surgeons which regulated practice did not accept women. Legal frameworks made it nearly impossible for women to own property or run formal businesses, and from the 13th century onward the Church enacted a series of restrictions on healing practice that fell disproportionately on women practitioners, particularly midwives and herbalists, whose methods derive from folk tradition rather than institutional authority. At the extreme end of this exclusion sits the witch trial. Historians debate the extent to which accused witches were specifically targeted because of healing practice. The connection is real in some cases and overstated in others, but the cultural linkage between women healers and dangerous transgressive knowledge was potent enough to function as a persistent deterrent across centuries. The phrase that still circulates in our language today, old wives' tale, was a deliberate invention of this exclusion, a mechanism for discrediting a category of knowledge by attaching it to gender and age. It persists because we absorbed it so thoroughly that we forgot it was a weapon rather than a description. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as formal medicine professionalized, and medicine became a credentialed, legally regulated, male-dominated enterprise, the practical knowledge that had lived in household recipe books and kitchen gardens, and the accumulated experience of midwives was systematically characterized as superstition, backwardness, or simply irrelevant. And in that characterization, medicine lost something genuinely valuable. Not everything. The women's tradition contained plenty of remedies that did not work, and a few that caused harm. No honest history pretends otherwise. But so did formal medicine on a scale that we have been tracing all evening, with considerably more institutional authority and considerably less accountability for the consequences. What was lost specifically was a certain quality of attention. The women healers, whether they were keeping those 400-item remedy books, or sitting at the bedsides of labouring neighbours or brewing foxglove tea in a Welsh kitchen, were paying attention to the patient as a whole person, in a specific context with a specific history. They were asking, what is this person's body doing, and what can I observe about it, and what has helped before? That question, clinical individual observational, is one that modern medicine has spent the latter half of the 20th century trying to relearn in the form of patient-centered care and individualized treatment, and the acknowledgement that lived experience of illness constitutes a form of knowledge that laboratory data cannot fully replace. The kitchen pharmacy did not survive in its original form. It was displaced, absorbed, sometimes plagiarized, mostly forgotten. The last generation of women whose primary medical resource was a handwritten household recipe book passed away sometime in the early 20th century, in the years between the two world wars, as pharmaceutical medicine consolidated its authority, and the act of treating illness without professional consultation became first unusual, then in most places unnecessary. But the knowledge did not entirely disappear. It was tested, refined, formalized, and returned to us in a different form. Aspirin, digoxin, morphine derived from the opium poppy that appeared in household remedy books for centuries, quinine for malaria from the bark that indigenous healers in South America shared with European physicians, penicillin from a mold that women in certain traditions had been applying to infected wounds long before Alexander Fleming spotted it in a petri dish in 1928. The kitchen pharmacy left us medicine. We just forgot to say thank you. And now, having honoured that quiet, invisible tradition, and truly I mean that, I think it is one of the most remarkable unsung stories in the history of human knowledge, it is time to move to the part of this journey that is perhaps the strangest and most dramatic of all, because everything we have explored so far, the rest cures and the spas, the bloodletting and the Mercury, the patent medicine wagons and the household remedy books, all of it unfolded in a world where surgery in the modern sense barely existed, where the inside of the body was to the physician standing at the bedside almost entirely inaccessible. The knife could reach it, but the pain of what the knife did and the infection that followed, almost inevitably those two obstacles, made surgery a last and desperate resort, not a tool of healing. Then, within a single decade in the middle of the 19th century, two separate discoveries changed everything. One of them was anesthesia, the ability to put a person into a deep pain-free sleep while a surgeon worked, and the other was antisepsis, the understanding of why patients kept dying of infection after operations that had technically succeeded. The story of how both of these were discovered, and the fierce, sometimes vicious resistance from the medical establishment that greeted them both, is one of the most extraordinary dramas in all of medicine, and we will walk into it together right now. Picture this for a moment. You are lying on a wooden operating table in the year 1845. The room smells of blood and something else, something you cannot quite name but that clings to everything, to the walls, to the coats of the men standing over you, to the instruments laid out beside your arm. The surgeon rolls up his sleeves. He has not washed his hands. No one has washed anything. The coat he's wearing is stiff with the residue of previous operations, and some of the surgeons of this era considered that stiffness a mark of distinction, evidence of experience, proof of a full career. He picks up the knife, and then you feel everything. Surgery before anesthesia was not medicine. It was something closer to controlled catastrophe. The patient was held down by several strong men or tied, and the surgeon's single most important professional skill, valued above judgment, above precision, above anatomical knowledge, was speed. How fast can you cut? How quickly can you finish before the patient screaming and struggling makes the procedure impossible? The great Scottish surgeon Robert Liston, operating in London in the 1830s and 40s, was famous for being the fastest knife in the city. He could amputate a leg at the thigh in under 30 seconds. Accounts from his operating theatre describe audiences yes audiences because surgery was then a spectator event, performed in tiered galleries packed with medical students and visitors, watching in stunned silence as Liston worked so rapidly that the sound of the saw was almost continuous, the limb falling before anyone had properly registered that the cutting had begun. Speed was mercy. Every second less was a second less of agony. And then on the morning of October the 16th, 1846, in a domed surgical theatre at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, everything changed. The man who walked into that room slightly late, which is the kind of detail that makes history feel real to me. The slight lateness, the ordinary human imperfection of it, was not a surgeon. He was a dentist. His name was William Thomas Green Morton, and he was 27 years old, and he was carrying a glass flask fitted with a wooden mouthpiece. Inside the flask was sulphuric ether. The patient was a young house painter named Gilbert Abbott, who had a tumour on the left side of his neck. The surgeon was John Collins Warren, the most distinguished physician in Boston, a man who had spent his entire career cutting through the screaming resistance of conscious patients, and who had agreed to this experiment with one imagines a combination of hope and profound skepticism. Morton administered the ether. Abbott breathed from the glass flask. Within minutes he was somewhere else, entirely not unconscious in the violent, convulsive way of someone knocked on the head but simply absent. Peacefully, quietly gone. Warren made his incision. Abbott did not scream. Abbott did not move. When it was over, and Abbott began to return to awareness, Warren turned to the gallery of medical students packed into the tiers above the operating table, and he said, and these are words that deserve to be remembered, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." Now I want to be fair to the complexity of what happened next, because the story of anesthesia's discovery is underneath its triumphant surface also a story about ego and greed and the particular kind of tragedy that befalls people who make genuinely important contributions to the world and then spend the rest of their lives fighting over the credit. The truth is that Morton was not the first person to use ether as an anesthetic. A physician in Georgia named Crawford Williamson Long had been doing exactly that since 1842, performing small operations on patients rendered insensible with ether in his medical office in the town of Jefferson, Georgia. Long had 6 witnesses. Long had documented cases. What Long did not have was an audience or the instinct to publish. And so the news of what he was doing stayed in Jefferson, Georgia, while patients in the rest of the world continued to be held down and cut awake. And there was Horace Wells, a dentist who had experimented successfully with nitrous oxide a year before Morton's demonstration, had arranged his own public demonstration at Harvard Medical School in January 1845, and had been humiliated when the patient cried out before the tooth was fully extracted, and the assembled students booed him from the room shouting "Humbug!" Wells, who had been right about the principle, was destroyed by the failure of the demonstration. He became addicted to chloroform in the aftermath of the controversy, was arrested after an incident he committed while under its influence, and took his own life in jail in 1848. Morton, for his part, spent the years after Ether Day, as October the 16th, 1846 came to be known, attempting to patent ether under the name Lethion, and charge other physicians for its use. He died in 1868, financially ruined, still fighting for recognition. His former chemistry professor, Charles Thomas Jackson, who claimed to have suggested ether to Morton in the first place, pursued the same dispute for the rest of his life, and died in an asylum in 1880. Crawford Long, who had quietly been doing the thing everyone else was arguing about since 1842, died of a stroke in 1878 while delivering a baby. He is the only figure in this story who was not personally destroyed by it. History sometimes has a sense of irony, but I want to pause here and sit with something that I find genuinely remarkable, and that tends to get lost in the drama of all this human wreckage. In the months after Ether Day, the news moved around the world with a speed that was remarkable for an era without the kind of communication infrastructure we now take entirely for granted. By December of 1846, ether was being administered in London. By January of 1847 in Paris. By March of 1847 it had reached Calcutta. Within a year, the transformation of surgery was essentially global. Think about what that means. Think about the ratio of suffering reduced to the time it took. Every week that passed in every city where the news arrived was a week in which some patient who would have been held down screaming was instead placed gently into insensibility. Every month was thousands of operations transformed from acts of barely endured torture into something approaching a clinical procedure. The speed with which the world adopted anesthesia tells you everything about the magnitude of the need it was meeting. The entire history of medicine contains few moments of relief quite as large as that one spreading outward from a glass dome in Boston. And yet, and here is where the story becomes complicated again in a way that I think matters enormously, the adoption of anesthesia created a new and immediately catastrophic problem. Because now that surgery was no longer limited by the patient's ability to endure pain, surgeons could do more. They could take longer. They could operate on parts of the body that speed had previously made unreachable. The surgical imagination, suddenly unchained from the constraint of the stopwatch, expanded dramatically, and the patients began dying of infection at rates that nobody had quite anticipated. This was not entirely new. Surgical wound infection had always been the great killer of the operating room. The phrase hospital disease was understood by every medical professional of the era. The gangrene, the septicemia, the erysipelas that swept through wards, killing patients who had survived their surgeries only to be carried off days or weeks later by something invisible and poorly understood. The surgeons of the pre-anesthesia era operated so quickly that many patients were gone from the hospital before the worst infections could take hold. Longer operations meant longer exposure. The gift of pain-free surgery had, without anyone intending it, extended the window during which the hidden killer could do its work. The best surgeons of the era knew something was wrong. They did not know what. Let me tell you about a Hungarian physician named Ignaz Philipp Semmelweis, who figured it out in 1847, proved it mathematically, and was then effectively destroyed by the medical establishment for saying so. Semmelweis was working at the Vienna General Hospital in the maternity division, and he had noticed something that he could not explain, and that no one around him seemed sufficiently troubled by. The hospital had 2 maternity wards. In the first ward, where medical students and physicians performed deliveries, the death rate from childbed fever, the puerperal fever that killed new mothers within hours or days of giving birth, ran between 10 and 20%, sometimes higher. In the second ward, where midwives worked, the death rate was consistently around 2 to 4%. The same hospital, the same patients, 5 times the death rate in the ward staffed by doctors. Semmelweis was obsessed with this disparity. In 1847, one of his colleagues, a pathologist, died after being accidentally cut during an autopsy. His symptoms were identical to childbed fever. And in that moment, Semmelweis understood. The medical students and physicians began every morning performing autopsies on the women who had died the day before. Then they walked directly to the maternity ward and examined the women about to give birth. They were carrying something on their hands, some invisible contamination from the dead bodies, and they were delivering it directly into the most vulnerable patients in the hospital. Semmelweis ordered mandatory hand-washing with a chlorinated lime solution before any examination. The death rate in his ward fell from roughly 10% to around 1%. The evidence was overwhelming. The conclusion was clear. The medical establishment rejected it completely. The reasons were multiple and from a certain angle almost understandable. Semmelweis could not explain the mechanism. Germ theory had not yet been formally established, and so his insistence that doctors' hands were killing patients felt to many of his colleagues like an accusation without a scientific basis. It also implied that doctors had been responsible for enormous numbers of deaths, which was deeply threatening to professional dignity, and Semmelweis himself, increasingly desperate and angry, as the opposition mounted, became erratic in his communications, writing letters of escalating fury to the obstetricians of Europe, calling them murderers, and demanding acknowledgement that he withheld from his critics. He was committed to a mental institution in 1865. He died there 14 days later at the age of 47. 2 weeks after his death, on the other side of Europe, Joseph Lister first applied carbolic acid to a surgical wound and began the work that would eventually prove everything Semmelweis had been saying. Semmelweis had been right. He simply lived in the wrong decade and died before the world caught up. Joseph Lister was a Quaker surgeon at Glasgow Royal Infirmary, quiet and methodical, and possessed of a quality that was genuinely rare in the medicine of his era. He read widely outside his own field. In 1865 he encountered the work of Louis Pasteur on fermentation and the germ theory of disease, and he immediately understood its implications for surgery. If living microorganisms caused putrefaction, caused the invisible rot that was killing his surgical patients, then the solution was not fresh air or cold water, or any of the other approaches being tried, but the direct chemical destruction of those organisms in the wound itself. He had heard that carbolic acid was being used to treat sewage in the city of Carlisle, reducing the smell of the treatment fields, and he found this detail significant, apparently protecting cattle grazing nearby from certain infections. He obtained carbolic acid. On August the 12th, 1865, he applied it for the first time to a surgical wound, an 11-year-old boy with a compound fracture of the leg. 4 days later, he removed the dressing. No infection. The bones were beginning to knit. There was no sign of the suppuration, the festering, the smell, the swelling that almost invariably followed this type of injury. Over the next 2 years, Lister treated 11 more cases of compound fracture using carbolic acid dressings. 9 healed without infection. He published his results in 6 articles in The Lancet between March and July of 1867, and then a great deal of the medical establishment told him he was wrong. I want to be fair here because it is easy from the distance of more than a century and a half to frame this as simple stubbornness or ego. Some of the resistance was that, but some of it was genuinely reasonable, at least by the standards of the time. Lister's methods were complicated and inconsistent. He kept changing the concentration of the carbolic acid, the method of application, the preparation of the dressings. The results varied in ways that were difficult to interpret without a proper statistical framework. Surgeons who tried to replicate his methods without understanding them fully got worse results. And the underlying germ theory was still contested, still not universally accepted as the mechanism of infection. The German and continental European surgeons adopted Lister's methods relatively quickly. The British establishment resisted for over a decade, and in that decade the gap between surgical outcomes in hospitals that used antiseptic techniques and those that did not was, we now understand, measured in thousands of lives. The surgeons of that era were not in the main cruel people or foolish people. They were operating within the limits of what their training had prepared them to know, and making decisions under genuine uncertainty. That is worth remembering, I think. The story is not a simple one of heroes and villains, But it is a story in which pride, the pride of a profession that had not yet learned the particular humility that good science requires, cost an enormous amount. By the 1880s, Lister had moved to London and was winning the argument. By the 1890s, antiseptic surgery was standard practice in hospitals across Europe and America. By the turn of the century, infection rates in surgical wards had fallen to a fraction of what they had been in the pre-Listerian era. The smell of carbolic acid became for a generation the smell of medicine, the smell of safety, the smell of a hospital where you had a reasonable chance of leaving alive. Lister died in 1912 at the age of 84, having lived to see his work transform the world. He received more honours in his lifetime than almost any British physician, before or since a baronetcy, a peerage, the presidency of the Royal Society. The brand of mouthwash that carries a version of his name in its etymology was introduced in 1879 initially as a surgical antiseptic, and then repurposed for oral hygiene, and the connection to Lister, though indirect, is genuine. What I find moving about Lister, honestly, is not the discovery itself. Discoveries happen. What moves me is the patients. The 20 years of carefully documented cases, the refusal to be deflected by the resistance, the quiet insistence meeting, every objection with more evidence, more cases, more data, more measured argument that he was correct, and that the correction of his colleagues was not personal but necessary. He was not a spectacular surgeon. Contemporary accounts note this quite plainly. He was not the fastest, not the most dramatic, not the most gifted with the knife. What he was right, and he was willing to spend 20 years proving it. Surgery after Lister was a different world from surgery before Morton. Put those two transformations together, anesthesia in 1846, antisepsis in 1867, and you have a period of roughly 20 years in which the practice of medicine was altered more fundamentally than it had been in the previous 2000. The operating theatre was no longer a room people entered in terror of both the knife and the infection that would follow. It was becoming gradually, imperfectly, fitfully, a place of healing in the straightforward sense, and yet even with pain conquered and infection beginning to be understood, there was still one vast territory of human suffering that medicine had barely touched. Because all of this transformation, all of this brilliant, costly, slowly won progress had happened in the realm of the body. The visible body. The mechanical body. The body that could be cut and sutured and dosed and drained. The other dimension of human suffering, the one that lived not in the flesh, but in the mind, in the mood, in the exhausted or terrified or grief-stricken interior of a person's experience, had been treated across the same centuries with remedies that range from the misguided to the cruel, and the story of how medicine finally began to reckon with that territory, not through surgery or chemistry, but through something far stranger and more intimate, is where we are going next. Something about the word bedlam sits differently once you know where it comes from. It is not a metaphor that someone invented. It is not a poetic exaggeration. Bedlam is a real place, the Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, founded in 1247, one of the oldest institutions in European history, dedicated to housing people whose minds had broken from the world in ways their families could no longer manage. And for several centuries, Bedlam was also without a trace of irony a tourist attraction. On Sundays for a penny you could walk in off the street and watch the patients. There are visitor accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries describing the galleries of Bethlehem as a form of entertainment, a spectacle of human distress that Londoners apparently considered comparable to the theatre or the bear-baiting pit. Samuel Pepys mentioned visiting. Tourists wrote home about it. The patients were fed after a fashion, and housed after a fashion, and otherwise left to constitute a kind of living exhibit of madness, for the edification and amusement of the paying public. That is the world that reformers walked into when, toward the end of the 18th century, a handful of people began to look at what was being done to the mentally ill and feel not academic discomfort, but genuine moral revulsion. Let me tell you about two of those people, because their stories run parallel in a way that I find remarkable. Two men in two different countries with almost no knowledge of each other, arriving at almost identical conclusions at almost the same moment in history, as though the idea had been waiting in the air for someone to reach up and take hold of it. The first was Philippe Pinel. He was a French physician trained in medicine at Montpellier who arrived in Paris in the 1780s and found himself drawn almost against his own expectations toward the study of mental illness, partly because a close friend had lost his mind and was placed in an asylum and then died there, and Pinel could never quite let go of the question of whether it had been necessary. In 1793, during the turbulent years of the French Revolution, Pinel was appointed chief physician at the Bicêtre, a vast institution on the outskirts of Paris that housed hundreds of male patients, many of them confined in chains, some of them having been chained for years in dark stone cells, in conditions that would not have been permitted for convicted criminals in a reasonably run prison. What Pinel did in those first months at the Bicêtre is the thing he is remembered for, though the historical reality is somewhat more complicated than the clean legend that formed around it. He ordered the chains removed. He had patients moved to clean, well-ventilated rooms. He forbade physical punishment. He insisted that the people under his care be spoken to as human beings, that attendants learn their names, observe their behaviours, take notes about what seemed to help and what made things worse. And what he found, and this is the finding that mattered, the one that changed the direction of psychiatric medicine for a generation, was that a significant number of patients who'd been considered hopelessly permanently insane began to improve. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough to make the point that the condition of extreme deterioration that so many asylum patients displayed was not necessarily the natural end state of mental illness. It was at least partly what happened to a human being who was chained in a dark cell for years with no human contact, no dignity, and no reason to remain connected to the world. The cruelty was not merely cruel. It was making people worse. Across the English Channel, a Quaker tea merchant in York named William Tuke arrived at the same conclusion through a different path. In 1790, a fellow member of the Society of Friends, a woman named Hannah Mills, was admitted to the York Asylum. Her Quaker community tried to visit her. They were refused. A few weeks later, Hannah Mills was dead. The circumstances were never clearly established, but the suspicion of mistreatment was powerful enough that Tuke could not put it aside. He was 60 years old. He had no medical training of any kind. He had run a tea and coffee business for most of his adult life. And he decided with a kind of quiet Quaker determination that I find genuinely moving that he was going to build a different kind of place. The York Retreat, which opened in 1796, was not a hospital in the sense that Bicêtre was a hospital. It was as closely as Tuke could make it a home. About 30 patients lived there at any given time as members of a small community in a country house surrounded by gardens. They were addressed as guests. There were no chains. There were almost no physical restraints of any kind. Patients worked in the garden, walked the grounds, participated in the daily rhythms of the household cooking, cleaning, tending animals. They ate meals together with staff. They were treated, in short, as people. The results were, by the standards of the era, remarkable. Patients who'd been considered incurable in other institutions recovered well enough to return to their communities. The recovery rates at the York Retreat were so conspicuously better than at comparable institutions that they attracted international attention. Samuel Tuke Williams' grandson published a detailed account of the retreat's methods in 1813, and within a decade the principles had spread across England, across Europe, and across the Atlantic to America. where a physician named Benjamin Rush had already been arguing on somewhat different grounds that the mentally ill deserve treatment rather than punishment. This movement, this philosophy of dignified human socially engaged care for people whose minds had become disordered, acquired a name. It was called moral treatment. And for a brief luminous period in the first half of the 19th century it actually worked. I want to ask you something while we're here because I find this question genuinely absorbing. What is the most effective thing you can do for someone who is suffering in their mind? The history of medicine has answered this question in an extraordinary variety of ways, ranging from the obviously wrong to the surprisingly right to the heartbreakingly well-intentioned but disastrously misapplied. And the moral treatment movement before it was overwhelmed by forces that had very little to do with medicine, gave an answer that modern psychiatry, after a century of pharmaceutical and institutional detours, is still in many ways circling back toward. Work if it is meaningful. Community if it is genuine. Dignity always. Fresh air. Purpose. Connection. The recognition that a person whose mind is in distress is still a person, and that personhood is precisely what must be preserved and appealed to and not extinguished. That answer is not wrong. It was not wrong in 1796 when William Tuke put it into practice in a country house in Yorkshire. It is not wrong now, but here is where the story becomes, as these stories so often do, considerably darker. The moral treatment movement succeeded well enough that it inspired something it was not built to sustain an enormous expansion of the asylum system. In the first half of the 19th century, across Britain and across the United States, institutions for the mentally ill were built in a wave of reforming enthusiasm. They were to be places of healing. They were to be built in the countryside, surrounded by gardens where patients could work. They were to be humane, ordered, dignified. They were to be precisely unlike Bedlam. In America, the person most responsible for driving this expansion was a woman named Dorothea Dix, and her story is one of the most extraordinary in the history of social reform. Dix was a New England schoolteacher who had spent much of her life ill. She suffered from tuberculosis and depression, and she spent years recovering from one or the other with a kind of grim tenacity. In 1841, at the age of 39, she agreed to teach a Sunday school class at a local jail in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And in that jail, she found people who were mentally ill housed alongside ordinary criminals in unheated cells, with no treatment of any kind, in conditions she later described in a report to the Massachusetts legislature as, and these are careful, measured words from a woman who knew how to make an argument. I proceed to call your attention to the present state of insane persons confined in this commonwealth, in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, pens, chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience. She spent the next 3 years travelling 10,000 miles by stagecoach, visiting over 500 almshouses, 300 county jails, 18 state penitentiaries, and an unknowable number of makeshift institutions. She documented everything. She brought her findings to legislature after legislature with a thoroughness and a controlled moral urgency that was almost impossible to dismiss. By the late 1840s, all but 2 of the original 13 American states had created or were building hospitals for the mentally ill. By 1890, every state in the country had at least one publicly funded asylum. Dorothea Dix had done something that seemed from where she stood genuinely transformative. She had converted the principle of moral treatment into brick and mortar, into actual buildings, actual gardens, actual places where actual people would receive actual care, instead of being left in cages. And then those places began to fail. The failure was not dramatic. It was not sudden. It was the slow, grinding erosion of a good idea under the weight of everything that good ideas run into when they encounter the real world at scale. Moral treatment, as Pinnell and Tuke had practiced it, required small institutions. It required staff who had time to know patients individually, to observe their particular patterns and needs, to speak with them, to work alongside them. It required careful selection of patients, people whose illness was recent enough and moderate enough that treatment had a realistic chance of helping. What the Great State Asylum Building campaign produced was the opposite of all of this. Institutions that began with 30 patients grew to house 300, then 800. By the end of the 19th century, some American state hospitals held several thousand patients, staffed by a fraction of the people needed to provide anything resembling individual attention. The gardens were still there, the countryside setting was still there, but the philosophy that had made those things meaningful had been diluted beyond recognition. Patients were classified and sorted and managed rather than treated. Attendants who were overworked and underpaid reverted in many institutions to the methods that supervision and idealism had briefly displaced restraints, isolation, fear. In 1887, a young journalist named Nellie Bly had herself committed to the New York City Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island by feigning mental illness at a boarding house. She stayed for 10 days and then published what she found. The articles, later compiled into a book titled 10 Days in a Madhouse, described patients lying unattended on the floors of overcrowded rooms, food that was barely edible, baths in water, that multiple patients used without changing nurses, who responded to any disturbance with physical force and an absolute indifference to the actual mental state of anyone in the building. Many of the women she met had been committed after examinations lasting only a few minutes, often conducted in languages they did not understand. Some of them Bly came to believe were entirely sane. The city of New York, embarrassed, added more funding. The conditions improved marginally. And the exposé made Nellie Bly briefly famous and marked for a new generation of journalists the possibility of a different kind of reporting going inside the story rather than standing outside it. But the reform that Bly's work produced was local and temporary. The structural failure of the asylum system was deeper than funding and could not be fixed with a legislative appropriation or a journalist's courage. What I find genuinely haunting about this chapter of medical history, and I have thought about it quite a bit, is how completely the moral treatment movement understood what it was doing, and how little that understanding ultimately mattered. Pinnell knew that his patients were deteriorating because of the conditions they were kept in. Tuke knew that connection and purpose and dignity were not luxuries, but therapies, that they addressed something real in the mechanism of mental suffering. The reformers of the American asylum movement knew that small institutions with engaged staff and meaningful work produced better outcomes than large custodial warehouses. They knew, and the system they built became within 2 generations a large custodial warehouse. This is the specific tragedy of moral treatment. Not that the idea was wrong, but that the idea was right and fragile, and the forces that surrounded it, the economics of scale, the politics of public funding, the social pressure to remove difficult people from sight, were wrong and powerful, and the powerful thing won. By the turn of the 20th century, the optimism of the asylum gardens had been replaced by something much bleaker. By the middle of the 20th century, the state hospitals that Dorothea Dix had fought to build were among the most damning indictments of institutional medicine in the developed world. And then, beginning in the 1950s and 60s, a new pharmacological revolution arrived, the first psychiatric drugs that could actually alter the experience of psychosis, and the asylums began to empty, and the people in them were released into a community that had not been prepared to receive them. And the question of how to care for a person whose mind is suffering in the absence of both the institution and the garden became and remains one of the most urgent and unresolved problems in all of medicine. And yet, And yet woven through this entire arc of failure there are the individual stories. The patient at the York retreat who'd been considered unmanageable at every prior institution, and who within 2 years of arriving in Yorkshire had recovered well enough to return to his family. The woman in Pinel's ward at the Salpêtrière who'd been considered permanently insane for years, and who, when the chains came off and the rooms grew lighter, and someone finally sat down and asked her what she was thinking, began slowly and then more steadily to make sense of the world again. Those stories are real. They are documented. They are not the story of moral treatment's institutional failure. They are the story of what happens when a person who is suffering is treated simply as a person. That truth did not disappear when the large asylums deteriorated. It went underground waiting, and it is still waiting in the best practices of the mental health workers who understand that the medicine in a bottle and the garden outside the window and the name that someone takes the time to learn and use are not separate treatments. They are the same treatment pointing at the same truth about what a human being needs in order to find their way back. We have now walked a long way through this history, through the rest cures and the spa towns, through the bleeding and the poison, through the kitchens where women kept families alive with plants, through the glass dome in Boston and the carbolic acid in Glasgow, and now through the gardens of the moral treatment asylums, where something genuinely right was briefly and imperfectly practiced. There are 2 more territories left to explore, and the first of them is perhaps the most surprising of all because it asks us to look at everything we have covered tonight from a completely different angle. Not at what medicine got wrong, and not even at what medicine eventually got right, but at something stranger and more humbling than either the remedies and practices that ancient and pre-modern medicine stumbled onto without any understanding of why they worked, that turn out, when examined by modern science, with its extraordinary tools, to have been correct all along. The accidental wisdom hidden inside what looked like ignorance. That is where we're going next. Here is something I find quietly astonishing, and I want to begin with it before we go anywhere else. In the year 460 before the Common Era on the Greek island of Kos, a physician named Hippocrates was advising his patients to eat well, to sleep regularly, to walk every day, to fast occasionally, and to pay attention to what they put into their bodies and how they used them. He believed that the natural healing force within each person was the greatest force in getting well, and that the physician's job was primarily to support that force, rather than to override it with dramatic interventions. 2,500 years later, the American College of Sports Medicine launched a global initiative called Exercise is Medicine. They recommended that healthy adults perform 150 minutes of moderate physical activity per week. Research teams published studies showing that regular walking reduced the risk of heart disease, cut the likelihood of developing diabetes by 58%, among at-risk adults lowered rates of depression, and significantly reduced mortality. A study of nearly 140,000 older adults published in 2017 confirmed that even walking less than the recommended amount was enough to significantly lower the risk of dying compared to doing nothing at all. Hippocrates had said the same thing in different words 2.5 millennia earlier. This is the territory we are entering now, the accidental wisdom. The things that ancient and pre-modern medicine stumbled onto, not because the theorists understood the mechanism, but because practitioners who were paying close attention to patients had noticed repeatedly across generations that this helped, and that did not. The things that the long arc of medical history dismissed as superstition or ignorance, and that the long arc of modern science has quietly, sometimes grudgingly found to be substantially correct. It is not a comfortable story for the history of medicine. It requires sitting with the somewhat humbling possibility that the same tradition which gave us bloodletting and mercury tonics and caged asylum patients also stumbled onto a body of practical knowledge that modern pharmacology and clinical research has spent the 20th century laboriously re-deriving from first principles, the wisdom and the harm lived in the same system. Understanding that I think is more honest than either pure celebration or pure condemnation, let us begin with something simple and then move toward the more complex. Honey. The Egyptians were using honey to dress wounds at least as early as 3,000 years before the Common Era. The Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, dating from around 1600 before the Common Era, and believed to be a copy of a document considerably older, describes closing wounds with sutures bandaging, preventing and treating infection with honey. The Ebers papyrus from approximately 1500 before the Common Era describes honey as a component of the most common wound plaster, combined with lint and animal fat. The lint provided absorbency. The fat provided a barrier. The honey provided something that the Egyptians could observe working but could not have explained in any mechanistic sense. What the honey was providing, as modern biochemistry eventually established, was an extraordinary combination of antibacterial properties. Its high sugar content creates an osmotic environment that bacteria cannot survive in. It produces a slow release of hydrogen peroxide that kills pathogens directly. It is acidic enough to inhibit microbial growth, and it contains additional antimicrobial compounds that are not yet fully characterized, which is to say the honey is still doing things that science has not completely explained even now. Manuka honey, derived from the tea tree plant in New Zealand and Australia, has been shown in clinical trials to kill bacteria that are resistant to conventional antibiotics, including the particularly troublesome Staphylococcus aureus strains that cause dangerous hospital infections. In 2004, sterile medical-grade fly larvae maggots and honey-based wound dressings both receive formal approval from the United States Food and Drug Administration as legitimate medical devices. Think about that for a moment. Honey on wounds, maggots on wounds. Two remedies that ancient practitioners used that the 20th century dismissed as primitive superstition, that the 21st century has formally licensed as medicine. And the maggots deserve a moment of attention here because their story is particularly striking. Battlefield surgeons during the Napoleonic Wars noticed something that made no sense to them, given what they understood, which was not very much about infection and wound healing. Soldiers whose wounds had become infested with fly larvae seemed to fare better than soldiers whose wounds had not. The maggots were consuming the dead and infected tissue, and something in the process appeared to accelerate healing and reduce the spread of infection. This observation was replicated independently during the American Civil War. Confederate surgeon Joseph Jones noted that soldiers with maggot-infested wounds had lower rates of gangrene and better survival outcomes. The observation went largely unheeded in the conventional medical literature. Then, in the 1930s, an American surgeon named William Baer formally studied the use of sterile fly larvae to treat chronic bone infections and difficult wounds, and documented results that were dramatically better than the standard surgical approaches of his era. Then antibiotics arrived and the maggots were abandoned. Why bother with living creatures when a pill could do the job? Then, by the late 20th century, bacteria had begun to develop resistance to antibiotics at a rate that alarmed the medical community, and researchers began revisiting older approaches. The maggots reappeared in clinical literature. They were studied rigorously. It turned out that the enzymes they secreted while consuming necrotic tissue not only cleaned the wound but actively killed bacteria, and bacteria could not develop resistance to being eaten by a small larva in the way that bacteria can develop resistance to a chemical compound. Today, tens of thousands of maggot therapy treatments are administered worldwide every year. They are particularly valued for treating diabetic foot ulcers, pressure wounds, and other chronic wounds that do not respond to conventional approaches. Ancient practice dismissed, rediscovered, validated. the same arc that carried honey from the Ebers papyrus to the medical supply catalogue. Now let us talk about garlic. Garlic is, in terms of the cross-cultural universality of its medicinal reputation, arguably the single most widely celebrated plant remedy in human history. Every major ancient medical tradition, from the Egyptian to the Greek, to the Roman, to the Chinese, to the Indian, independently converged on garlic as a substance with significant healing properties. The Codex Ebers, the great Egyptian medical compendium from 1500 years before the Common Era, prescribes garlic for parasites, circulatory ailments, and general debility. The pyramid builders at Giza received daily garlic rations. There is a recorded work stoppage, something close to a strike in ancient Egypt when the garlic supply failed. Hippocrates prescribed it. Roman soldiers carried it on campaigns as both food and medicine. In China, records from 2000 years before the Common Era described garlic as part of the daily regimen, particularly combined with raw meat. Indian Ayurvedic physicians included it as a standard component of therapeutic diets. What they had all independently observed was real. The active compound in garlic allicin, which is released when raw garlic is crushed or chopped, is a broad-spectrum antimicrobial agent that works against bacteria, viruses, fungi, and certain parasites. It is why Louis Pasteur, who knew more about bacteria than almost anyone alive in the 19th century, reported in 1858 that a small amount of raw garlic juice was as effective as 60 milligrams of penicillin in killing bacteria in a laboratory setting. It is why British and Russian soldiers used diluted garlic solutions to treat wounds in the First World War, a practice that earned garlic the nickname Russian penicillin in that conflict. It is why medieval plague doctors included garlic in the herbal preparations packed into their beaked masks, and why, though this is not what they believed they were doing, the antimicrobial compounds they were inhaling would at minimum not have hurt them and might genuinely have offered some small protection. Modern studies have confirmed that garlic lowers blood pressure, reduces cholesterol, supports immune function, and may reduce the risk of certain gastrointestinal cancers. Its broad-spectrum antimicrobial properties are of particular interest to researchers working on antibiotic resistance, because the multi-compound mechanism of allicin makes it difficult for bacteria to develop resistance the way they develop resistance to single-molecule pharmaceutical antibiotics. The ancient physicians had no idea why garlic worked. They simply knew from millennia of observation that it did. Now I want to pause here and ask you something, and I want you to genuinely think about it. How many things do you do every week for your health, or that you avoid, because someone older in your family told you to, or because it is simply a habit that has been in your family or your culture for as long as you can remember? Do you eat ginger when your stomach is unsettled? Studies confirm that gingerols, the active compounds in ginger, are genuinely effective against nausea. Do you reach for chamomile tea when you cannot sleep? The apigenin in chamomile binds to the same receptors in the brain that benzodiazepine sedatives target, producing genuine mild sedation through a mechanism that scientists only characterized in detail in the last few decades. Do you gargle with salt water for a sore throat? That one goes back to ancient India, the Ayurvedic practice of gandusha, and it works because the salt draws fluid from infected tissue and creates an unfavorable osmotic environment for bacteria. You may have been practicing evidence-based medicine for years without knowing it. One of the more striking examples of this pattern comes from a very unlikely plant. Turmeric, the yellow spice that has coloured the cuisine of South Asia and the Middle East for thousands of years, was prescribed in Ayurvedic medicine for inflammation, for digestive complaints, for wound healing, for respiratory conditions. The ancient Indian medical texts described it as a warming, healing, cleansing substance. Chinese medicine prescribed it for liver conditions and for pain. The active compound is curcumin. The pharmacological research on curcumin that has accumulated over the last several decades is frankly remarkable in its breadth. Studies have found significant anti-inflammatory activity, antioxidant properties, some evidence for neuroprotective effects, ongoing research into its potential role in managing conditions from arthritis to Alzheimer's disease to certain cancers. There are thousands of peer-reviewed papers on curcumin's biological activity, representing an investment of research effort that the ancient Ayurvedic physician, sprinkling turmeric into a healing preparation, would have been entirely unable to imagine. What that physician was doing, though, was genuinely correct. The mechanism which involves curcumin's ability to inhibit specific inflammatory signaling pathways in the body at a molecular level was unknown. The observation that it helped was not. And then there is the broadest category of all, the one that in some ways I find most interesting. The ancient insistence across multiple independent medical traditions that movement, rest food, and the basic conditions of a human life were therapeutic agents of the first order. Hippocrates wrote, or the Hippocratic corpus records, since scholars debate how much of it he actually wrote personally, that food and exercise, while possessing opposite qualities, yet work together to produce health. He provided written exercise prescriptions. He emphasized sleep, diet, and the relationship between the body and its environment. He was in his own very different framework articulating what we now call lifestyle medicine. The idea that the most powerful interventions available to a physician are not drugs or surgeries, but changes in how a patient lives. The physician Susruta working in India several centuries before the Common Era prescribed moderate daily exercise as a standard component of treatment, making him, as far as the historical record shows, the first documented physician to do so in writing. Galen, building on the Greek tradition, made exercise a central component of his medical recommendations for patients managing chronic disease, and his influence on Western medicine extended until the 16th century. What these ancient physicians observed was that patients who moved regularly, who ate diets built around whole foods with significant plant content, who slept consistently, and who had purposeful activity in their daily lives, those patients simply got sick less often and recovered faster when they did get sick. Modern medicine has spent the last several decades producing an enormous body of evidence confirming this observation, with the precision that ancient practitioners could not have hoped to achieve. The specific mechanisms, the cardiovascular adaptations produced by regular aerobic exercise, the anti-inflammatory effects of certain dietary compounds, the role of sleep in immune function and tissue repair. The metabolic benefits of occasional fasting were entirely unknown to Hippocrates or Susruta, but the observation that motivated the prescription was not wrong. It was within the limits of what observation without molecular biology can achieve essentially correct. I want to be careful here because this kind of history can be misused. The fact that ancient medicine got some things right does not mean that ancient medicine was right about everything, or that the systematic evidence-based testing that modern science applies to medical interventions is unnecessary, or that unverified traditional claims deserve automatic credence. Most of what ancient medicine prescribed, and we've been cataloguing this throughout this entire video, was wrong, and some of it was actively harmful. The presence of honey and garlic and willow bark in the ancient pharmacopoeia does not redeem calomel or bloodletting or the ritual purging of patients who were already critically ill. What it does mean is something more nuanced. It means that the human project of trying to understand how the body heals and what helps, it has been going on for a very long time, and that careful, sustained observation, even without the theoretical framework to explain what is being observed, can produce knowledge. Slow, incomplete, culturally shaped, mixed with error in ways that are difficult to sort without the tools of modern science, but genuine knowledge accumulated from the observation of real patients over real time. The grandmothers and the physicians and the healers and the wise women whose knowledge we have been tracing all evening were not simply wrong. They were working with the tools and frameworks they had, and within those limitations they were doing what humans have always done, watching, trying, remembering, passing it on. Some of what they passed on was wrong. Some of it was right in ways that science is still in the process of fully explaining. There is a word that keeps appearing in the modern research literature when scientists write about compounds derived from traditional medicines, a word that I find quietly moving actually when I encounter it in a technical paper. The word is validated. Validated. As in this thing that people believed and practiced for generations has now been tested by the methods of modern science and found to be at least in part true. Validated honey. Validated garlic, validated willow bark, the tree whose bark humans have been chewing for pain relief for thousands of years, long before anyone understood that its active compound would one day be refined into the most widely used drug in human history. Validated exercise as medicine, validated sleep as restoration, validated the human need for connection and purpose and dignity as determinants of health, which is in the end what the moral treatment movement understood and what the asylum gardens were trying to provide. There is something about that word, about the image of ancient practitioners being handed a verdict across the centuries, that I find genuinely tender. They were trying, they were often wrong, but they were paying attention. And the paying of attention sustained across enough generations produced something that deserved to survive. We're nearly at the end of this long, strange journey. We've travelled from the first sanatoriums where tuberculosis patients breathed clean air in the Swiss Alps, all the way through the urine wheels and the laudanum bottles and the mercury ointments and the maggots and the foxgloves and the asylum gardens. There is one final place to go, and it is perhaps the most important, because it is less about history than about what all of this history means. What does it tell us, everything we have explored tonight about what it means to be a patient, and what it means to practice medicine, and what the long struggle toward healing, with all its catastrophic failures, and its surprising triumphs, and its accidental wisdom, and its institutional failures has actually been reaching toward? That is the question we're going to sit with in this final part together in the quiet that all good histories eventually earn. What does it all mean? That is the question I have been sitting with as we have moved through this long evening together, and I do not think it has a single clean answer. The history of medicine is not a story with a tidy moral, but it does have something, I think, a shape, a direction, a set of lessons that emerge from the chaos and the failure and the occasional brilliance and the very long, very expensive process of human beings trying to understand the body they live in. Let me try to say what I think those lessons are. The first thing that strikes me looking back across everything we've covered tonight is how much of medical history is the history of confidence. Not competence, confidence. The physicians who bled George Washington to death in 1799, draining roughly 40% of his blood in 12 hours for a throat infection, were not uncertain. They were not experimenting. They were applying what they considered to be the settled and authoritative medical knowledge of their era, derived from a theoretical framework that had been respected for 2,000 years. They were confident. The doctors who prescribed calomel mercury chloride for everything from infant teething pain to tuberculosis to ingrown toenails were not villains. They were following a therapeutic tradition that had been endorsed by the most respected medical authorities in the world, prescribed in the best textbooks administered by the most credentialed practitioners. They were confident. The asylum superintendents who built those grand institutions in the countryside, who genuinely believed they were creating places of healing, who had read the statistics from the York Retreat and the case notes from Pinnell's ward, who sincerely wanted to do right by their patients, were confident that they understood what was needed. The confidence was in each case the problem, not the desire to help, not the effort. The unexamined certainty that the current framework was adequate to the complexity of the human body. There is a concept in modern medicine called clinical equipoise. It essentially means the state of genuine uncertainty that makes a randomized trial ethical, the acknowledgement that we do not yet know whether treatment A or treatment B is better, and therefore a patient could reasonably receive either. It is in a sense institutionalized humility, the built-in acknowledgement that medicine does not yet know what it thinks it knows. Semmelweis had the answer to childbed fever in 1847. He had the data, he had the observations, he had the mechanism in broad outline even without germ theory to explain it at the molecular level. What he did not have was an audience willing to sit in equipoise, willing to say we might be wrong about this, let us look at the evidence. And so women died. Not from lack of knowledge, but from lack of the willingness to admit that knowledge might be incomplete. Pierre-Charles Alexandre Louis had shown in 1835 with actual numbers that bloodletting made pneumonia patients worse. His data were clear. His paper was published and read. And bloodletting for pneumonia continued to be recommended in standard medical textbooks for more than a century after his paper appeared. The numbers were not enough. What was required was a change in the culture of medicine, a change in the relationship between the practitioner and uncertainty that did not happen quickly or painlessly. Does that mean we should distrust modern medicine? I want to be careful here because I think this history can be read in two very different ways, and one of them leads somewhere genuinely dangerous. The first reading says, look how wrong they were confident and they were wrong. Therefore, confidence in medical knowledge is inherently suspect and the alternatives deserve as much credence as the mainstream. The second reading says, look how they became less wrong. Look at the mechanism by which error was identified and corrected. Look at what changed: the introduction of numerical data, clinical trials, systematic recording of outcomes, peer review, the gradual development of a culture that rewarded questioning evidence over deferring to authority. Look at the fact that the medical community of 1847 did not have the tools to evaluate Semmelweis, and the medical community of 1970 had those tools and used them to build an evidence base for hand-washing, so overwhelming that it has since prevented millions of deaths. The second reading is the honest one. The history of medicine is not evidence that medicine cannot be trusted. It is evidence of how the process of building reliable medical knowledge works slowly, painfully, through the accumulation of error and the gradual development of better methods for identifying it. We're not standing at the end of that process. We're somewhere in the middle of it. There are things that current medicine is confident about that future medicine will find it was wrong about. That is not a reason to reject the best available evidence. It is a reason to hold it with appropriate humility while acting on it. Let me tell you about something that happened in 1984, because I think it is one of the most important stories in this entire history, and it is recent enough that some of you listening tonight may remember it. A young Australian physician named Barry Marshall was working at a hospital in Perth, and he had become convinced against the settled consensus of gastroenterology that most stomach ulcers were caused by a bacterial infection, rather than by stress spicy food or excess stomach acid as was universally believed. His colleague Robin Warren had discovered under the microscope that the stomachs of patients with ulcers consistently harboured a curved bacterium. Marshall thought the bacterium was causing the ulcers. The medical establishment thought this was implausible, to the point of being faintly ridiculous. The stomach, after all, produces strong hydrochloric acid. How could bacteria survive there? The stomach was considered an essentially sterile environment. Marshall could not get approval for a clinical trial. He could not get his papers accepted. He could not get the medical community to take his hypothesis seriously enough to test it rigorously. And so, In 1984, in what may be the most dramatic act of medical self-experimentation since the 18th century, Barry Marshall drank a petri dish of the bacteria. He gave himself a stomach ulcer. He documented it by endoscopy. He treated himself with antibiotics. The ulcer resolved. He published the results. He and Warren received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2005. The treatment of stomach ulcers was transformed, a condition that millions of people had been managing for their entire lives, with antacids and dietary restrictions, and the resigned acceptance of chronic discomfort turned out to be a bacterial infection. Treatable, curable, with a course of antibiotics. Approximately 2/3 of the world's population carries the bacterium Helicobacter pylori in their stomachs. Most of them will never develop ulcers from it. But for those who do, the discovery that Barry Marshall made by drinking a petri dish in Perth in 1984 has been in the most direct and unambiguous sense life-changing. It is a story about a man who was right and dismissed, but it is also, and this is the part I want to linger on, a story about a system that eventually corrected itself. Marshall could not get attention in 1984. By 2005 he had the Nobel Prize. The correction was slow and took too long and came at real cost to the patients who were treated incorrectly in the intervening years. But it happened. The system worked. Imperfectly at painful cost, with the kind of grinding friction that institutional knowledge always produces when it encounters a challenge. But it worked. I want to come back at the end of this journey to something that runs underneath all of it, a thread I have been following without quite naming it. Every story we've encountered tonight, from the sanatorium in the Swiss Alps, to the foxglove growing in the English Midlands, to the chained patients in the Paris asylum, to the ether frolics at Harvard Medical School, has at its centre a human being in distress looking for help. That person, the patient, is the whole point. Everything else is apparatus. The theories and the textbooks and the institutions and the professional hierarchies and the patent medicine wagons and the carbolic acid and the Nobel Prizes, all of it exists, at least in principle, in service of that one person in distress. What strikes me reading this history carefully is how often the apparatus forgot about the person at the centre, how often the theory displaced the patient, how often institutional confidence overwhelmed individual attention, how often the need to maintain the dignity of the profession prevented the practitioners of that profession from looking clearly at what they were doing and what it was producing. And then, at irregular intervals, someone looked. Pinnell looking at the chained patients and asking whether this was necessary. Semmelweis looking at the death rates on the 2 maternity wards and asking why they were different. Pierre-Charles Alexandre Louis looking at his bloodletting cases and actually counting the outcomes. William Withering watching a woman recover from a condition he had expected to kill her, and following that anomaly until he understood what had caused it. Looking. The simple, careful, attentive act of looking at what was actually happening to actual people, without the distorting filter of what the theory said should be happening. That act, which is in some ways nothing more than the original act of medicine, the physician sitting at the bedside and paying attention, is the thing that has always moved medicine forward. And it is also the thing that is most easily lost when confidence becomes entrenched and institutions become self-protecting, and the looking gets replaced by sighting. There is one more thing I want to say before we end, and it is the thing that feels most personal to me, the thing that has stayed with me through all the research that went into this video. The people at the centre of these stories, not the physicians, not the reformers, not the discoverers, the patients. The woman George Washington tried to save and inadvertently killed with too much blood removed too quickly, the mothers dying of childbed fever in Vienna, while Semmelweis shouted into a silence that would not break. The infants given Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup and soothed into something far deeper than sleep. the men and women chained in the dark at Bethlehem while tourists paid a penny to watch them. They deserved better than they got. They deserved practitioners who were humble about what they did not know and honest about the limits of their tools and willing to say, "I am not certain," rather than reach for an intervention that the framework demanded but the evidence did not support. They deserved the kind of care that the best practitioners in every era were trying to provide the Listers and the Tukes and the Dorothea Dicks and the Barry Marshalls, but that the worst tendencies of medical culture kept preventing. The reason to know this history is not to feel superior to the physicians of previous centuries. They were working with what they had in the frameworks they had inherited, under the constraints of what their era knew and did not know. The reason to know this history is to carry forward the one thing that has always mattered in medicine, and that has always been in danger of being lost to confidence and theory and institutional momentum. That one thing is attention. The kind of attention you pay when you're genuinely uncertain and genuinely trying to understand. The kind of attention that says, "This person is in front of me. I am not certain I know what they need. Let me look more carefully." From the sanatoriums to the spas, from the poison cabinets to the patent medicine wagons, from the foxglove tea to the ether frolics from the asylum gardens, to the carbolic acid spray from the chained patients, to the ones who were finally unchained. This has been the story of human beings trying to help each other through suffering, getting it wrong with astonishing persistence and creativity, and slowly, painfully finding their way towards something more reliable. It is not a story that is finished. Medicine today is incomparably more effective than anything we've encountered tonight. Life expectancy has roughly doubled in the developed world over the last century and a half. Diseases that killed millions in the 19th century, tuberculosis, cholera, smallpox, childbed fever, have been either eliminated or reduced to a tiny fraction of their former devastation. The surgeries that Liston had to complete in 30 seconds to spare his patients the full duration of their agony are now performed hour after careful hour on deeply anesthetized patients whose sterile wounds will heal without infection. This is a miracle. It is worth saying plainly and without irony, this is a genuine miracle accomplished by the accumulated effort of generations of people who paid attention and asked difficult questions and refused to accept the answers they were given when those answers did not match what they were observing. And it is still in the ways we've been tracing unfinished. There are things modern medicine is currently confident about that it will later find it was wrong about. There are patients whose distress is being explained by the framework when the framework is not adequate. There are remedies sitting in the traditional knowledge of human communities that have not yet been validated by the tools that could validate them. The paying of attention goes on. You have travelled through quite a lot of history tonight, and if you are still with me at this hour, I am genuinely grateful for your company. There is something particular about going to sleep with a long story in your mind, the way the details settle and rearrange themselves in the dark. The way a history heard in a quiet voice becomes something you carry rather than something you merely know. I hope what you carry from tonight is something of the human scale of it. The ordinary people in all of these stories, the patients who deserved better and sometimes got it. The practitioners who were trying in their particular historical moment, with their particular limited tools, the reformers who looked clearly at something everyone else had stopped seeing and refused to look away. And I hope, if nothing else, that you carry the thought that honey on a wound is not ignorance, that the woman keeping 400 remedies under lock and key in her household was not superstitious, that the old physician who told you to walk more and eat real food and sleep enough was not wasting your time, that the long accumulation of human attention to human suffering has left us among all its failures and embarrassments and tragedies, something real, a residue of genuine knowledge won at great cost worth preserving and worth building on. Thank you for spending this evening in history with me. If this kind of storytelling is something that finds you at the end of your day and helps you rest a little more easily, a story worth knowing told slowly enough to settle, I hope you will stay for the next one. There are so many more stories to tell, and the nights, as it turns out, are long enough for all of them.